The tale kicks off with a guy who's bleeding out and gasping for air. He reminisced about their journey to this point, although it was overshadowed by laser beams raining down like confetti at a bad party. He clung to a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could take the bad guys down. But in a split second, something rude poked him right in the chest. He froze like a deer in headlights. Took him a second to realize, wow, I now have a hole in my chest. He crumpled to his knees, and that's when reality hit him like a ton of bricks. It was a seriously brutal smackdown. He face-planted into the ground like a pancake. Then it dawned on him he was probably gonna die without even getting a chance to make a witty last speech. His vision swam as he peered forward, staring at the flying humanoid menace known as the Liquidator, mankind's ultimate foe. One day, this mysterious creature waltzed in and wiped out a whole continent like it was nothing. In this crazy world, a special task force was whipped up to stand against these creatures. The first recruit, Brian Miller, was a guy who managed to walk away from a giant meteor crash without so much as a scratch, all thanks to his trusty shield. Folks can't help but call him the world's bumper sticker. I mean, the world's protecting shield. Also in the mix is an archer who knocked out a high-level dragon in one shot. That badass goes by Jacob Bloomfield, the Divine Archer. And let's not forget the strongest swordsman to grace existence, the Sword Saint herself, Amy White. And then there's our lot dubbed the support unit. Corpses were already decorating the area like they were on sale. The man teetering on the edge of death. Our protagonist was a foot soldier named Gray Lee, who figured they were all just cannon fodder. He watched the elite members go all out and thought, wow, they're on a whole different level. He knew that the graduates from the World Union Academy were top-notch, but he didn't realize the gap was going to be an abyss of epic proportions. Those elite warriors unleashed attacks that actually landed on the Liquidator. It left him feeling a bit down, thinking about how much it might not matter if the support unit showed up at all. Meanwhile, Amy was still locked in a fierce spat with the Liquidator, trying to turn him into a shish kebab with her lightning-quick jabs. Gray clenched his teeth, seeing that gaping chasm in skills was painful enough to bring tears to his eyes. The Liquidator danced around the blades until at long last, one blade managed to give him a little love tap. He was taken aback that Amy actually got a hit in. Suddenly, the Liquidator got serious, unleashed a super-fast move, and whoosh, he cleaved one of the elite in half. They crashed down like a bunch of overripe fruit blood gushing everywhere. Gray's eyes popped wide open in disbelief. The Liquidator was now showing his true power. All fun and games were officially over. Gray couldn't wrap his head around the fact that the enemy wiped them out with a single attack. He hated to admit it, but winning seemed like a fairy tale at this point. He lay there in a puddle of his own blood, still hanging on to consciousness. Time had passed since his heart got skewered, and he wondered why he was still kicking. As his blood pooled, a voice whispered weakly, "I've finally found you." A drop of blood flickered into a little light and morphed into a message. Gray was summoned to come forth because he held incredible power. He jolted awake, baffled. Taking in his surroundings, he was in a dark place, surrounded by stone structures, making him think he might be in an afterlife, though pretty barren, and bleh. Beyond that, he noticed someone perched on a throne looking pretty godlike, with their black clothing horns and a veil that covered their forehead with a golden mark on their chest. That being had a calm, unruffled expression. The mysterious figure spoke to him, assuring him that he hadn't kicked the bucket and that his physical wounds had been mended. This got Gray thinking. They showed him a screen displaying his previous beat-up body. He asked if he was the one who healed him. The figure replied that it wasn't him. It was actually Gray's own hidden power. This threw Gray for a loop. The mysterious being couldn't exactly explain it, as it was a puzzle, even for him to figure out Gray's abilities. But they guaranteed him his power was stronger than what the Liquidator packed, if only he could steer it right. Gray asked if that meant they could actually win the fight. The figure responded that he didn't know and cautioned him not to get too hopeful just yet. However, they believed they needed to get rid of the Liquidator, leading them to stand up, and jab Gray right in the chest so he could get back to the action. Then blam, a bright blue light exploded. A magic circle materialized on Gray's chest. The voice announced it would lend him its power. Finally, Gray woke up on top of his blood-soaked corpse. He snatched his sword, which was now oozing dark energy. He was told that this was all his own doing. The mysterious creature informed him that his power isn't visible to the eye. Gray got it. The Liquidator finally caught sight of him. Without a second thought, Gray slashed at the Liquidator. The creature was taken aback. It couldn't believe a strong opponent still stood. His chest got a nasty scratch. Gray recognized that his attack actually did some damage. He charged in again. He confidently declared that his power was stronger, but the Liquidator warned him not to underestimate it. The next thing Gray knew, his world flipped upside down. It took him a moment to grasp what just went down. His body was sliced in half. Only his lower half was left with blood gushing out like a fountain. The Liquidator clapped for him, praising him for compelling it to use its full strength. Suddenly, a black mist enveloped the area, and a hooded figure appeared. Sporting a mask, it resembled a moving shadow, its body flickering like black flames. The mysterious figure raised its gigantic black sword, leaving the Liquidator utterly confused. He was feeling pretty cocky, convinced his powers were better than everyone else's, but the Liquidator was like, "Hey, don't underestimate me, buddy." Before Gray could even process that, he was left stunned. It took him a hot minute to wrap his head around what just went down. His body was split in two, and his lower half was just sitting there, leaking blood like a busted fire hydrant. The Liquidator gave him a pat on the back, saying, "Good job pushing me to my limits." Out of nowhere, a spooky black mist rolled in, and a hooded figure popped up like the worst magician ever. He had a mask on, very mysterious, and his body looked like it was made of dark flames. He raised a ridiculously huge black sword, leaving the Liquidator scratching his head in confusion. He instantly conjured a shield around himself. The black flames fizzled out on the left side of his face, and it soon became clear that it was Gray. The Liquidator raised an eyebrow and asked if he was actually human. Gray shot him a fiery glare, then lunged at him. His sword clashed against the barrier. He pushed hard, hoping to smash through it. The Liquidator then noticed something odd. His barrier cracked, and the sword managed a clean slice. "Are you really human?" he demanded again. Gray smirked and replied that he was starting to wonder the same thing himself. With a determined step forward, Gray acknowledged that the Liquidator was not to be trifled with. The Liquidator was astonished he was still standing. It began to breathe heavily, creeping closer as it hissed that it would crush him repeatedly until he was nothing but a memory. But Gray had other plans and struck first. The Liquidator yelped as he was slashed, yellow blood spraying everywhere. "You monster!" it screeched, but it was far from finished. A glowing aura enveloped its body as it summoned more power, clapping its hands together until a magic circle began to glow. "Time's up," he declared dramatically. Our hero gripped his enormous sword, bracing himself for the Liquidator's next move. Gray blinked in surprise as darkness suddenly descended, but he shrugged it off, no big deal. He darted behind the Liquidator, aiming for a clean neck slice, but his sword collided with a barrier instead. That shocked him. The Liquidator smirked, saying it was futile, since within the realm of true dusk, nothing could hurt him. He suggested Gray quit flailing around and enjoy the view of the stars. Gray's eyes widened as he noticed the stars twinkling brightly back at him. One star grew larger and radiated dazzling light. The Liquidator exclaimed how beautiful it was, comparing it to the sun just before it plummeted from the sky. The impact was catastrophic, like firework gone rogue. A massive crater formed where our hero once stood, leaving the Liquidator chuckling, assuming Gray wouldn't survive being turned into stardust. But surprise, a swirling portal began to materialize, blooming into a large magic circle. A voice echoed, lauding the immense power that had gathered. The Liquidator realized it was enough to send Gray back in time. Suddenly, he recognized the voice. Kronos was back in action. Kronos called out to the wielder of great power, asking if he could hear him loud and clear. With a full tank of energy, he decided to send Gray back to the past. The Liquidator let loose a stream of curses at Kronos. Kronos shot Gray a reassuring look, saying that this was the best he could do for him. The magic clock began to tick away. As it counted backward, when it hit one, he entrusted Gray with the world's fate. And just like that, Gray found himself jolting awake, sprawled on a patch of grass. Confused and slightly bewildered, our main character peered around. He was in a sunny field surrounded by lush green grass. Glancing to his right, he recognized it instantly. It was Renato Village, his hometown. But how could it be? It had been flattened 15 years ago. Then it hit him. He'd been sent back to the past. Time travels do exist. He couldn't wrap his head around the mind-boggling reality of it all. Propping himself up on his hands, he caught sight of the wound on his body. At that moment, he remembered getting bullied by Belder and his crew. He swore to himself he wouldn't let those guys push him around any longer. though he knew deep down there was a good chance those bullies were still stronger than him. He sighed, lamenting that defeating the Liquidator was probably just a figment of his imagination. He resolved to strategize a plan for dealing with them once he beefed up a little. I can't get hurt, but as luck would have it, while trekking through the woods, he stumbled right into them. The ringleader was none other than the biggest jerk of the lot, Belder. That punk had 3 henchmen in tow. He swaggered up to Gray, announcing that he'd been hunting him down and had a rough time doing so. Gray stayed on guard. Belder tossed a sword at his feet, taunting him to pick it up. Gray looked at it like it was an alien artifact, prompting Belder to call him out for playing dumb. He made it clear he wanted a practice match. Gray wasn't having it, claiming his injury was still raw. He politely thanked him for the offer, saying he couldn't join the game until he healed up. Belder sneered, saying he didn't have to fret because the blade was just a toy. Gray reasoned that zombies, notwithstanding a hunk of iron, could still hurt if delivered right. Belder erupted, yelling for him to zip his trap. He sneered that Gray had no say in the matter. If he wasn't keen on swords, he could always go with bare fists. Belder charged like a bull, catching Gray unprepared. Gray couldn't believe he was coming at him unarmed. Yeah, this clearly wasn't just a friendly sparring session. He recalled what the military doc had told him before he jumped back in time. The doc claimed Gray's sword skills had plateaued due to an old injury from his childhood, a defining moment that marked the beginning of his unfortunate Loserville saga. He smoothly dodged Belder's attack, throwing his opponent off slightly. Belder clicked his tongue in frustration, while Gray mused that Belder's strikes seemed slower than molasses. He ducked to evade another swipe, their movements turning into a strange sort of choreographed ballet where Belder swung and Gray dodged. Then it hit him. It wasn't that Belder was slow, he'd actually gotten quicker. The 3 amigos were gaping at his newfound agility, exclaiming he appeared like a totally different dude. He confidently picked up the sword, knowing he might not have the same body, but he carried the memory of every fight he'd ever faced. As Belder made a bold leap to attack, Gray swung deftly, expertly deflecting the blow just in time. But hey, he had the battle memories engraved in his mind. Belder jumped in to slash him. Even though it was a surprise attack from behind, he smoothly parried it like a pro. He swung his sword with his good hand, and Belder took a hit, letting out a tiny groan. Gray was shocked that it was enough to knock him off his feet. It made him wonder if it was even fair to fight such a newbie. Then again, he figured the dude didn't deserve any sympathy. After all, those jerks had tormented him just because he wasn't able to throw punches. But hey, those days were over. He swung again, and this time Belder dropped his sword like it was hot. Belder shouted some colorful curses. When Gray saw him ditch his sword that easily, he realized this guy was worse than just a beginner. He pointed out that Belder probably never learned how to take a hit from a sword. Our good old MCMC cut in front of Belder and assured him there was nothing to fret about. Holding his sword, he confidently claimed that as long as the blade was dulled, it was totally safe to whack someone with it. Belder got smacked, and he couldn't believe his shoulder started bleeding, with blood splattering across his face. He screamed like a banshee and dropped to his knees. Gray was stunned to find that the blade was indeed dull, but if it hadn't been, Belder could have been toast. He glared at them and kept swinging away. Belder got clocked on the nose. There was a lot of blood as he tumbled onto his back. Gray figured he might as well keep using the dull side. Towering over Belder, he asked why he was howling so much. Seriously, he didn't have the right to scream when he was the one who said a blunt sword was safe. Gray flashed him a mischievous grin. Belder was starting to panic. He hollered at his 3 buddies to stop gawking and back him up. The 3 guys looked like they'd seen a ghost because Gray had suddenly become a powerhouse. One of them suggested they sneak up on him together from behind. They closed in on him. Gray cheekily asked if they wanted another round. Belder told his pals to finish him off. Gray was going to let it slide, but then he changed his mind. The forest was noisy with their ruckus. Those 4 ended up a bruised mess with big bumps on their heads, barely able to open their eyes. They knelt there like some obedient puppies, hands resting on their laps. Gray couldn't believe he used to be scared of these guys. He asked if they were from the serious swordsmanship dojo. Belder nodded and replied it was something like that. One of them piped up that they thought they were strong enough, so they hadn't been going much lately. In his head, he questioned what strong enough even meant. He figured he couldn't expect much from the dojo itself. But hey, he knew it had its perks. He was itching to get introduced to the dojo since it was by referral only. Belder advised him to ask someone else because if he told his master he lost, he wouldn't want to be around when she found out. Gray swung his sword in front of Belder and suggested they keep going. Naturally, Belder freaked out. He bolted away, shouting that the dojo was that way. The others were stunned by how quick he took off. They shouted at him not to leave them behind. Soon enough, they made their way into the city. Belder wondered why Gray wanted to join a dojo. Gray explained it was because they had a recommendation slot for the academy. Belder confirmed he'd heard about that. RMC chimed in that was the reason he was interested. One of the lackeys insisted Gray was already strong enough. Gray sighed, wishing that were true, but he knew even the toughest crew on the planet couldn't hold a candle to the Liquidator. Even with Kronos' power, he couldn't nick him when he got serious. He was at a loss for how strong he needed to be to whack that thing. But still, he had some hints. Belder pointed towards the dojo, and Gray nodded. The moment he clashed with the Liquidator, he felt that dark power right there at his fingertips. What he focused on at that moment was the swordsmanship the Sword Saint had taught him. He figured if he had just dedicated more time to training in swordsmanship, like the Sword Saint had shown him, maybe the battle would have had a different ending. He realized that was probably why Kronos nudged him in that direction. They finally arrived at the dojo, and when the lady heard them, she wanted to confirm if her former students tried to bully a civilian using her sword techniques and ended up getting their butts kicked. She clicked her tongue in disapproval. This lady was the swordsmanship dojo mistress, Sarah. Belder attempted to defend himself by saying it was just a mock battle. She didn't let him finish and whacked him so hard he flew back, slamming against the wall with a loud crash. The other three stood there, eyes wide in shock, trembling like she could tell he was just spouting excuses. She sternly informed him that if beating up an unarmed person was a mock battle, then what she just did was a mock battle too. She pointed her sword at his eyes while telling him to scram and never come back. She declared they could no longer call themselves students of her dojo from then on. They all stammered in agreement and hurried away. She sat down in front of Gray, apologizing profusely. She admitted that her ex-students had caused him plenty of headaches. He waved it off, saying there was no need to stress over it. She thanked him for being so understanding and brought up the recommendation he wanted for the academy. She wanted to apologize again for the trouble caused by Belder and his crew, but as much as she'd love to write him a recommendation letter, she had to check out his skills first. Just to confirm those knuckleheads tried to mess with the civilian sporting sword skills they learned from her, only to get their butts handed back to them on a silver platter. She couldn't help but click her tongue. This lady was the dojo instructor for sword skills. Sarah Belder tried to argue that they weren't picking on him. It was just a mock battle. But she didn't leave it at that. She smacked him so hard he went flying and slammed into the wall with a loud wham. The other three stood there, eyes as wide as saucers, shaking like leaves. She knew he was just spinning a yarn to back himself up. If he thought calling a beating a mock battle was clever, then surely she could declare her smackdown the same. Her sword was aimed right at his eyes as she told him to scram and never come back. She declared they could no longer parade around calling themselves dojo students from that day forth. They all squeaked out yes ma'am and skedaddled away. She then plopped down in front of Gray and said sorry, acknowledging her previous students had been a handful. He told her not to sweat it. She thanked him for being understanding, and then mentioned he wanted a recommendation to the academy, right? While she wanted to say sorry for the ruckus Belder and the gang caused, if she was going to write a letter of recommendation, she needed to see what he could really do first. She wanted to say sorry for the havoc Belder and his crew stirred up, but as much as she'd enjoy whipping up a glowing letter of recommendation, she needed to gauge his skills first. She handed him a wooden sword, and Gray took it like it was a golden ticket to the theme park. She told him he could have the first shot, encouraging him to swing away whenever he felt like it. And just like that, he went full-on pirate mode and started whacking at her. The dojo was starting to take notes on his sword skills. She noticed his swordplay was surprisingly effective for a kid his age. It was as if he had already been in a dozen epic sword fights. Then she lunged at him, and he swatted her attack away like a pesky fly. It dawned on her that Belder and the crew wouldn't stand a chance against him. Sure, it looked like he taught himself, but every so often his moves resembled those of seasoned academy knights. She became curious if someone had trained him. While his technique was a bit rough around the edges, she couldn't help but think he might actually have some hidden talent, a real diamond in the rough. Time to wrap it up, she thought. She charged at him, and he was gearing up for a strike too. Their swords clashed like two angry cymbals. They went at it again, and she found it odd that he wasn't even breaking a sweat. Gray was keeping pace with her like a pro. She wanted to put his skills to the test, but he was pulling out all the stops, leaving her questioning her sanity for even wanting to challenge him. Fear crept in. Gray was scaring her. He swung that sword with such force that she took a stumbling step back. She wrote it off as just a wild swing, and boom, suddenly she spotted his weakness. Seizing the moment, she lunged to finish their duel, but unexpectedly found herself puzzled. Sarah's sword was now in two pieces that left Gray looking like he'd seen a ghost. It was an odd sensation for him, bringing back memories of a time when he thought he still had that kind of power. But boy, did it come with a price. The pain surged through him, dropping him right onto his knees. CO, eyes wide with worry, asked him what was the matter. He realized his body wasn't keeping pace with the power surging through him. His legs quaked like jelly, but he stood up and mumbled that he was fine. Deep down, he knew he couldn't keep using that power willy-nilly. He contemplated spilling the beans to Sarah about it, but she was giving him that, "Why are you staring at me like a deer in headlights" look. He shouldn't tell her, because even if he did, she'd probably think he was just pulling her leg. So he settled for a lame excuse about getting a tad too enthusiastic. Deep inside, though, Sarah was well aware that there was no way to slice through her sword with a hunk of wood, and she knew he was onto that as well. When she noticed him staring blankly, she asked what was wrong. It clicked for Sarah that he had no plans of revealing what went down. Thinking out loud, she mentioned he wanted a recommendation to the academy. He nodded and said he heard she was the one who could help. With a smile, she told him she could hook him up with a ticket to the kingdom's top-notch school, the Royal Academy of Swordsmanship. But she warned him he shouldn't go there because she believed he wasn't cut out for it. Ouch. That stung, a harsh reality check for him, ramming home his insecurities about not having enough strength, especially when he felt like all he had to show for it was that final moment. Sarah turned to him and revealed a different target he should aim for: World Union Academy. Gray's eyes nearly popped out like a cartoon character in shock. She wasn't suggesting he only aimed to be the best in the kingdom. No, he was meant for more. He belonged at the world's elite institution that blew his mind. He knew that was where the Sword Saint and others had come from. He was practically speechless. Could someone like him really get in there? Surprisingly, she shot him down, saying it was impossible. And they both knew it. His body was nowhere near fit to handle a sword properly. Sure, at the Royal Academy he might pull off a facade, but the World Union Academy, forget about it. She posed a valid question. How was he supposed to gain that kind of skill with his floppy body? He couldn't deny it. Everyone from there was an absolute monster, and he felt like a puppy trying to play with lions. A wave of sadness washed over him. Sarah caught his gloomy expression and asked why he seemed to be throwing in the towel. She reminded him there were still 9 months until the entrance exam. He gave her the classic, "It's just 9 months" excuse, but she insisted it wouldn't be easy taking the exam somewhere he wasn't familiar with, so it was best to arrive early. She handed him some cash for the trip and a month's worth of food, but he hesitated like she was offering him a moldy sandwich. A month early. That's practically asking for a time warp. He felt like she was booting him out of the village. "You're just thinking too much," she retorted. He shifted gears and brought up the issue of an ogre's nest in the area. That took her by surprise. He continued that there weren't many guards in town. She tried to brush it off coolly, insisting it was nothing to worry about. Of course, help would arrive from the royal capital, so no biggie. 8 months later, things were looking pretty different. Sarah noticed he was packing on some muscle, and she was out of things to teach him. She urged him to strut out there with confidence. He was all confused because the exam was still a month away. "Listen," she explained, "taking an exam in a place that's as familiar as a stranger's attic isn't going to be easy, so best get there early." She handed him some cash for the trip and a month's worth of snacks. He was hesitant to take it also, thinking that leaving a month early felt a bit excessive. He couldn't shake the feeling she was trying to push him out of the village, but she dismissed it as overthinking. He then mentioned an ogre's nest that was found nearby, and you could see her surprise. He added that the village barely had any guards around. She tried to play it cool, saying it didn't concern them, and reassured him that help would cruise in from the royal capital. He couldn't shake his feeling she was trying to push him out of the village, but she said he was just being a worrywart. He reminded her about the ogre's nest, and she looked genuinely taken aback. He mentioned the lack of guards in the village. She shrugged it off nonchalantly, telling him it was no biggie, and assured him that the royal capital would come through with some backup. Had nothing to fret about. She insisted he should waltz into that exam like he owned the place. Deep down, he could sniff out the fib. He was wise enough to know that no cavalry was coming to save the village, and just before the village bit the dust, his master was set to pay the ultimate price. In his past shenanigans, he caught wind that she met her end while trying to face off against an ogre solo. Still, he merely said he got what she was throwing down. He gave her thanks and said he was about to take off. She shot him a sly grin and wished him luck on that test. Later that evening, skeletons were hanging from a tree like twisted ornaments, complete with sticks sticking out of their mouths. Sarah made her entrance in the woods. Following the scouts' chatter, she traced a crimson trail leading to a spooky hideout. But she put on the brakes when a voice rang out asking where the heck she thought she was going. When she looked up, there was Gray just chilling on a tree branch. He flashed her a grin and called her master. She was taken aback to see him there. She wondered why he was loafing around when he was supposed to be heading to the academy. He tossed the same question back at her once she mentioned that the elite army was supposed to take care of the ogre nests. She replied that the army had flaked out due to an emergency, so she opted to tackle it herself. She reassured him that she'd be just fine because she'd already scoped out the nest's strength based on the scouts' gossip. She mentioned that the big cheese was an elite ogre and the nest hosted around 40 to 50 little critters in total. She admitted that the swarm might pose a bit of a challenge. Reflecting on it, Gray thought that wasn't exactly a fortress of doom, but the real kicker was that the ogre had brains and leadership skills. Gray knew the dangers of getting cornered, and fighting solo was practically a one-way ticket to a spicy end. He was dead certain of one thing. If he let his master go solo, she'd probably end up as Ogre Chow, and the village would toast to the ogre's destruction. He had caught a glimpse of that disaster in his own two peepers. He voiced that he wanted to tag along. She shot him down, insisting that she was more than enough. He gave it another shot, claiming he didn't want to miss out on some legit battle experience. Then he asked if she thought he'd be in her way. That got her to chuckle, since she knew all too well he wouldn't be a bother, especially since she had pretty much taken all the gold in their mock battles. She pointed out that nobody could predict what could pop up in a real fight, especially in a monster's den that spontaneously appeared. For something dangerous like that, it was best to wait until he'd had a bit more practice under his belt. Seeing she was unyielding, he came up with a dangerous job like that. She figured he should wait until he had a smidgen more real fight experience. He realized she was set in her ways, so he tossed out a new idea that caught her interest. He said he'd give her a good knock on the head, then go mano a mano with the ogre himself. Judging by his stance, he seemed pretty serious. The dojo was left speechless. Eventually, she caved, but put one condition on the table. No matter what goes down, he needed to come back breathing. He promised he would, and returned the favor by wishing her long life, too. Beneath the moonlight, they huddled behind a rock, scoping out the ogre gang. The terrain offered 0 escape routes. Their choice of nest location screamed confidence. This also meant that Gray and Sarah would be stuck, too. Considering they were up against smart monsters, he decided to play it smart. She started to scrutinize the ogre colony, and when she couldn't spot the boss, she assumed it was chilling inside the tent. They could only cross their fingers and hope to whittle their numbers down before the big boss stepped out. She instructed Gray to knock off any enemies he could spot on one side, while she had the other side covered. Gray nodded, and they bolted in. One ogre had a hunch something was up. Before its tiny brain could process, Sarah was already in its grill and took its head for a spin. The other ogre witnessed the head do a little tumble on the ground. It immediately clued in the other ogres, and soon enough, a horde came barreling in. Meanwhile, on Gray's side, he was mowing down foes one after the other. He zipped around. Just like Sarah, it turned into quite the slaughterhouse. Eventually, they regrouped, and a mountain of ogre carcasses lay strewn across the floor. She complimented him, and even asked if this was truly his debut. But Gray quickly switched gears, reminding her to keep her wits about her. They were only scratching the surface. Deep down, he sensed something was off. The ogres felt way too flimsy, if they were really that weak. He knew his master could have handled them all by herself, so he figured the real bad news must be hanging out inside that tent. A pair of glowing red eyes peeked out from the pitch-black darkness. They zeroed in on him, sending shivers down his spine. Without a moment's hesitation, he shouted they needed to scram. He urgently told her to book it right away. Sarah asked what had him in a tizzy. He looked frantic as he yelled for her to just run. She picked up on his urgency and off they went. But as they dashed, something leaped over them. To their shock, an ogre landed smack in their path, cutting off their escape route. Sarah rolled her eyes at the sight of the elite ogre. With a sarcastic tone, she said it was a privilege for the boss to come meet them personally, but Gray shot back that it wasn't the boss. Then another ogre released a thunderous roar. It was so loud that Sarah instinctively covered her ears. Right after that, a swarm of ogres burst onto the scene. They were in a frenzy. She stood flabbergasted at the spectacle and asked what in the world was happening. At the back of the horde loomed a colossal ogre. Gray exclaimed it was something way tougher than any elite. He dubbed it the Ogre General. It was the real head honcho of the nest, with the elite ogre blocking the escape and a mob of ogres obstructing the front they were boxed in. The Ogre General remained still, but its aura was spine-chilling. Once she heard behind the horde was a colossal ogre. Gray claimed it was way stronger than your average elite. He labeled it an Ogre General, the big cheese calling the shots in that nest. With an elite ogre on guard at the exit and a swarm of ogres blocking the front, they were in a real pickle. The Ogre General stood still, but the very vibe it gave off was pretty bone-chilling. As soon as she heard, Ogre General Sarah was all ears. They realized they weren't about to win this battle on their own. She glanced over at the elite ogre and proposed they take out the one right in front of them and make a run for it. She leaped into action, but her strike bounced right off. She gathered her focus and slashed again. She managed to leave a little scratch on its shoulder. Much to her surprise, the wound started to heal like it was a scrape from a toddler's fall. Gray told her it was a lost cause. The general's roar was like rocket fuel for the ogre's strength and healing. That explained why they felt like they just downed 5 cups of coffee, and here she was struggling to take out just one of them. Gray kept on swinging away, trusting her to watch his back. He assured her that she didn't need to be the hero here. All he needed was for her to give him some breathing room. She started to worry and asked what he had in mind. He replied there was only one option left on the table to take out that ugly ogre general, and he was dead serious. An ogre wielding an axe knocked Gray's sword away. Our main character was losing patience every time they tried to flank him. The ogre was keen on making him drop his sword, then raised its axe high to bring the thunder. At that moment, Gray was laser-focused on taking out every foe in his path. But the ogre easily shattered his sword like it was made of cheap plastic. He realized that his weapon couldn't handle the oomph of a supercharged ogre. The ogre swung at him again, and he just barely dodged it in the nick of time. He was thankful he had a spare, but he was also aware it wouldn't last long either. Sarah spotted his dilemma and tossed over her extra sword. He expressed his gratitude. Now he was armed with 2 swords. But he knew he still didn't have enough firepower to take them all down, so he zeroed in on the Ogre General and those pesky hordes in between. He whipped out the second sword and with a swift motion sliced through the ogres like butter. One of them managed to give him a little love tap on the cheek as it lunged in. He blocked the hit while the ogre tried to shove him back with its axe. He clicked his tongue and then pressed harder with both swords. More ogres were pouring in like they were at a Black Friday sale. The Ogre General's weapon began to glow ominously. Then it let out a roar that could shatter glass. Gray flinched. He watched as the ogres became even more muscular. They charged at him once more. He suddenly realized the Ogre General had figured out his strategy. It roared again, and Gray now understood it was not just a big brute, it was smart. His sword clashed against the ogre's axe. He was pushed back, but forced himself to keep moving. He dashed forward, taking down as many as he could. He knew he couldn't waste time on every single one of them. Out of nowhere, an ogre tackled him. It pinned him down while another raised its axe like a kid about to swing at a piñata. Gray quickly slashed the grappling ogre across the neck. He realized they were trying to exhaust his swords by throwing themselves at him. Just as he was dealing with that, a shadow loomed above him. An ogre leapt towards him, ready to deliver a knockout punch. He tried to block its fist with his sword, but it was so powerful it sent him flying. Gray coughed up some blood. His body was quaking like a leaf in the wind. He was panting heavily, and his sword was a pile of splinters. He found himself down to his last sword. He couldn't believe he was facing a horde of ogres and a general armed with just one sword. And due to his experience from before he regressed, he knew there was no way he'd come out on top. He then thought, since that was the case, she found it funny, but running wasn't an option, Sarah said while fending off incoming blows. He challenged her if she really planned to just roll over and die. He promised he'd chase after her, but she insisted it wasn't about that. She wore a grim expression until she finally conceded that she couldn't run anymore. Her leg was slashed and bleeding like a broken faucet. Gray went pale at the sight. Now he was completely out of options. In his mind, he had gone back in time with one goal, in sight, take down the Liquidators. He swung his sword while thinking his life could end right then and there. His last sword shattered into a million little pieces, but he refused to give in. He tried to recall how that immense power felt before. He focused on tapping into it again with one ultimate mission, to crush his enemies. As the ogres lined up to finish him off, he forced his memory to resurface. He tried to remember that feeling he had way back when. Gray shut his eyes and pressed them tightly closed. Just as the last shard of his sword flew right in front of him, he opened his eyes and they glowed a fiery red. He could finally feel it. He swung his shadow sword, delivering a deadly blow to several ogres at once. A mist enveloped part of his face and his blade. Sarah was taken aback. Gray wore a serious expression, but when he glanced at her, he cracked a smile, telling her everything was going to be okay. With one mighty swing, he severed multiple ogre heads in a single swoop. The ogre general's sword started glowing again, but in an instant it was cut down to size. Sarah noticed this, but while she was distracted, an ogre tried to sneak up behind her. She realized the attacks felt more like weak high fives. She remarked that they used to give her a real challenge, but now slicing through them felt like cutting through warm butter. She concluded that without the general's boost, they were pretty much a joke. By the time they finally defeated the ogres, it was deep into the night. Gray apologized for breaking her sword. She waved it off, especially since he had just saved her neck. He handed it back to her. She was getting ready to ask him about the strange power he just wielded when Gray suddenly collapsed. He hit the ground face first. Sarah panicked, yelling out his name. Gray's consciousness drifted into a dark abyss. He wondered where in the world he was. Everything was dark as night except for a single door standing in front of him. He looked around, completely lost. Black flames suddenly burst through the chains on the door. He recognized that. It was the same power he had tapped into earlier. He pondered if opening that door would allow him to access that power once more. The thought sent shivers down his spine. Still, he slowly approached it. But out of nowhere, he felt a menacing presence lurking behind him. It made him freeze in his tracks and backpedal. His breathing became fast and erratic. Deep down, he knew that if he opened that door in this state, he felt a seriously spooky presence creeping up behind him. It froze him in place like a deer in headlights and made his breath come out fast and shaky. Deep down, he had this gut feeling that if he opened that door now, he was totally gonna bite the dust. Then out of the blue, a voice chimed in, saying he made the right call. Suddenly, he snapped awake, gasping for air and soaked in sweat. Sarah jumped in surprise. He was finally back from dreamland. He wanted to know where he was. Sarah filled him in that he was in the village infirmary and added that he had been out cold for 5 days. She also confessed that she was terrified he might never wake up. The moment he realized he'd been snoozing for 5 days, it hit him that he had totally overdone it. Sarah remarked that overdoing it didn't quite cover what he had pulled. But putting that aside, she checked if he could move. Gray attempted to shift, but quickly figured out his right arm had joined the no strength club. He could wiggle it if he really tried, but it made him uneasy. What if he couldn't even swing a sword anymore? To make matters worse, his arm had a bizarre bruise that looked like a toddler took a paintbrush and spilled black ink all over it. Sarah figured he wouldn't be moving it anytime soon. Well, Gray wondered if she could even notice the black blotch. He admitted he couldn't muster a bit of power from his main arm, just as she thought it wouldn't be healing up as quickly as he'd like. All the bones in it. His right arm were donzo. He was flabbergasted. It didn't even hurt. She explained that they had used a magic potion to treat it. That blew his mind. Magic potions cost a fortune. She assured him not to stress. The village chief was the one who forked it over. Gray couldn't grasp why the chief would spare such a precious item for someone like him. She looked at him like he was lost and reminded him he was the village's hero. Gray was totally in the dark. Just then, someone bounded into the room. It was the village chief. Gray hopped up to thank him for the potion right away. But the chief said they should be the ones showering him with thanks. With all the feels, the chief said Gray had battled an ogre general, a beast that made even the toughest fighters from nearby towns sweat, and that monster had come knocking at their village's door. He squeezed Gray's hand, saying if Gray hadn't kicked its butt, the village would have been history. The chief elaborated that without him and Syria, there wouldn't be any potion, no infirmary, and definitely no survivors. None of them would even be hanging out together. Gray shot back that he was being dramatic, but the chief stood firm. Deep down, he felt the chief was spot on. Gray pondered that for a second. Somewhere along the line, he found himself agreeing with the chief, since before he got sent back, the village was toast, thanks to the ogre attack. The village chief told him if he still didn't get how crucial his actions were, he'd be more than happy to lay it all out for him. Plus, he heard Gray was planning to take the academy entrance exam and wanted to know if that was true. Gray's only response was a confused, "Oh." His mind was racing. He took down the ogre a week before the exam and had been out cold for 5 days, meaning he only had 2 days left. He turned as pale as a ghost the moment he remembered the trek to the academy. It was a 3-day hike. Riding a horse would cut it to a day, but he was strapped for cash. He quickly asked the chief if he could borrow a horse. The chief, already prepared, had the stallion of the century all set for him. With that bad boy, he'd be there in a flash. Sarah joked that if he hadn't woken up that day, they would have had to haul him there while still snoozing. She swung open the door. The sunlight hit him like a light bulb, making him squint. He saw the horse chilling outside with a massive crowd around it, waving banners thanking him and cheering him on for the exam. Everyone had wide grins plastered on their faces, showing their gratitude. A bunch of people came up to express their thanks personally. One dude stepped up and handed him a pouch. Gray was like, "What's this?" The man said it was the entire village chipping in to help. They heard applying to the World Union Academy was no walk in the park. Gray was super touched by the gesture. He beamed and thanked them, then joked that it'd be tricky to come back if he tanked the exam. Sarah told him not to sweat it. After all, he was the only applicant to the World Union Academy who had taken down an ogre general, but Gray couldn't shake the worry about his right arm. She reminded him his left arm was still in working order. He nodded in agreement. Sarah reassured him that was more than enough, and he didn't need to rely on that strength anyway. He countered that the exam might be tougher than it sounded. Passing it with just one arm didn't seem like a piece of cake. Sarah gave him a confident pep talk. She said he would definitely stand out, and the examiners would see his strength. She was all in with her belief. She declared, "You will pass." He was grateful and thought with her saying it like that, he had no choice but to pull through. In his past life, their village had met its doom. But now it was thriving. Gray realized the world had flipped, and that could mean a different future ahead. All thanks to his awesomeness. And now he was ready to roll. He made it just in the nick of time. He even gave a little thank you to the horse for the speedy ride. Looking straight ahead, he spotted a city wrapped in a lake. He had finally reached the World Union Academy. In the arena, the host announced it was time to start handing out exam tickets. Until then, all examinees had to stay put inside the central arena. There were tons of people, but only 20 would snag a pass. Someone noted that the number of successful candidates flipped every year. Sometimes 50 made it through, sometimes just one. The host then invited Professor Ariel to the front. She strolled in and got right to passing out exam tickets. She asked the examinees to grab the paper that popped up in front of them. Then she snapped her fingers. A golden glow lit up the arena. Papers appeared in front of each examinee. Gray was the 513th examinee for the fencing course. He spotted that everyone else had their own shiny ticket too. She gave a quick explanation that they would only see their special number in the course, assuring them that this was the way they roll every year. She flashed a tiny smile, then informed them that the World Union Academy doesn't discriminate based on age, gender, nationality, or even what your name is. None of that jazz counted. She said the only ones who would be asked for their name were those who aced the exam and earned the privilege to cross the bridge. And get this, they could even use a fake name if they felt like messing around. Gray was scratching his head in confusion. Despite leaving his sword back at the inn, his paper still claimed he was in the fencing course. This left him puzzled about what kind of magic school system they were using. Professor Ariel then broke it down. They assigned the courses based on looks. She said if she messed up anyone's course, they should wave their hand like they're in a game of Simon Says. The examinees were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe she picked them just by glancing, especially with that bustling crowd. Some guessed she must have Googled them all beforehand. Others thought she could have some mind-reading wizardry going on. But after a bit, no one raised their hand, so she wrapped up the moment by declaring no one was misassigned. Next, she revealed their exam schedules. She told everyone to check their magic tickets. Gray's paper said he was slotted for the first day at 11 o'clock sharp. Not ideal. He wanted a little more time to let his arm recuperate. Professor Ariel reminded everyone that it was a now or never practical exam. If they snoozed, they'd be out, no exceptions, no rescheduling. Gray cradled his arm, thinking it still felt about as strong as wet spaghetti. He silently wished it would perk up by morning. The next day rolled around. He was sweating bullets because it hadn't healed one bit. He had no choice but to tackle the exam with his arm still feeling like a soggy noodle. He was summoned to the arena entrance. He inhaled deeply, giving himself a pep talk not to be a negative Nancy about it. He assessed that his left arm still worked, and his right had some wiggle to it. He used the little time he had left to scope out the examiner's moves and hunt for an opening. The examiner instructed the examinee to strike first. The examinee dashed toward the examiner. He took a big breath and told himself not to dip into the negativity pool. He assessed that his left arm was still working, and he could move his right a bit too. He spent the time he had left watching the examiner's moves, searching for a chance to strike. The examiner told the candidate to take the first swing. The candidate charged at the examiner, his swings like lead weights, but the examiner was slow and not nearly as tough as he thought. He recalled his master's encouraging words that he would absolutely pass. The swords clashed, and he managed to overpower the examiner. That's when he started to believe in himself. But the examiner just sidestepped like it was a casual stroll in the park. The examinee hollered that he wasn't finished yet. He gripped his sword with both hands and slashed again. The examiner blocked it with just one hand like he was swatting a fly. Watching this unfold, the examinee's spirit took a nosedive. The professor then charged at him, sending him flying with just a single swing. The guy crashed onto his back, and the examiner wrapped up his exam. He was told to retrieve his weapon and exit the stage. Gray couldn't help but grin a little. He already had a sinking feeling about his fate. There was absolutely no way The examiner called Gray's number. As he made his way towards him, he couldn't believe he had to face someone who'd taken down a dude twice his size with just one arm. Gray was told to make the first move. He felt like he was climbing Mount Everest with no gear, but he decided to give it his best shot. He charged at the examiner. He remembered what Saria told him. It's not just your arms that swing a sword, it's your whole body channeling power through your arms. Even if his right arm was dead weight, he thought about all the muscle power. He swung his sword, and the examiner ducked like he had just spotted a bear. Gray was a bundle of nerves since he couldn't fight like he usually did. He thought if effortlessly swinging a sword without arm strength was that easy, why would anyone bother to train in the first place? Then the examiner countered. That's when Gray got all mixed up. The instructor's sword came at him like it was in slow motion, allowing him to block it. He could feel the examiner had some uncanny strength, but his speed and technique were nowhere near his master's level. He believed if he relied on the sword skills he learned from her, maybe he could even... Gray's eyes sharpened, and he thought if it was that simple, he needed to adjust his game plan, because this examiner was indeed a bit slower than he initially thought. Remembering his master's words about passing, he clashed swords with the examiner and found himself overpowering him. That's when a smidge of hope sparked within him. The duel raged on. Although he had seen the examiner, it became clear that winning with just one hand was a taller order than he thought. As they continued to exchange blows, the examiner's movements became a bit more wild. With a risky maneuver in mind, he found his moment and baited the examiner for an attack. The examiner lunged, throwing a wide swing. Gray feigned to his right, but he also knew most fighters. Out of nowhere, Gray positioned himself behind the examiner. Uh-oh. The examiner didn't see that coming. Gray realized that regardless of the strength difference, if he could sneak behind it would give him a shot. But just as he was about to pounce, they were suddenly told to freeze. The tip of his sword was practically kissing the examiner's back. Then the other examiner announced that the time limit had hit. His eyes popped open wide as the result was revealed. It was a draw. Gray could hardly believe his ears. He thought there was no way he was making it through this thing. Their sword fight rolled on, and while Gray had seen the examiner's skills, he barreled toward him, only for the professor to sidestep, which made Gray think the power difference was too much for him to break through. It finally hit him that trying to win with just one hand wasn't as easy as he thought. But as they went back and forth, he noticed the examiner's moves getting sloppier. Gray had a risky play up his sleeve. He found the perfect moment and baited him right in. The examiner lunged, and that was exactly what he wanted, a big wide swing. He shifted his weight onto his right foot, knowing it would leave him open. He also knew that most opponents would go for a flashy swing. Out of nowhere, Gray zipped around to the examiner's backside, catching him totally off guard. Our MC understood that regardless of how big the power gap was, if he could just sneak behind. And that's exactly what he wanted, for him to throw a massive haymaker. He shifted his weight to his right foot, fully aware it would leave an opening. He also realized most opponents would be itching to go for the big, obvious smack. Out of nowhere, Gray was already sneaking up behind the examiner. The guy completely lost his marbles. Our hero figured that it didn't matter how sky-high the power gap was. If he could just sneak behind, he could totally take them down. But just then, they were told to freeze. The tip of his sword was practically spooning the examiner's back. Gray pondered if the match was really done. He had a feeling it was a wee bit premature to call it quits there. The other examiner chimed in, announcing that time was up for him. His eyes went wide as the result was blurted out. It ended in a draw. Gray was pretty sure he'd be taking the long walk home. His grip on the sword slipped like a banana peel, as if his body had thrown in the towel. He shuffled out of the arena, feeling a bit bummed because he had given it his all. To make matters worse, he knew if he couldn't outshine the examiner, life was going to be as hard as finding a needle in a haystack. He hoped his arm would bounce back next year so he could take another crack at it. Just before he left, he shot one last glance and muttered a thank you like it was a sacred mantra. Fast forward 1 week to the World Union Academy's secret lair meeting room 53. The Academy's big cheese asked the professors to spill the tea on how they felt about the candidates after everything had wrapped up. One of them sighed like a deflating balloon, claiming he was more exhausted than a marathon runner. An elder professor piped up saying watching everyone do the same thing together was like herding cats and suggested splitting the tasks next year. Another professor jumped in defending that they couldn't afford to overlook a diamond in the rough just because they wanted an easier time. The head honcho rolled his eyes and reminded them he asked for thoughts on the candidates, not a critique of their whole operation. He then zeroed. The screens flashed, and one of the professors declared, just like always, the ones who knocked the examiners out of the park passed, while the rest would hang in limbo based on how they showcased their skills during the 15-minute countdown. He turned to his fellow swordsmanship course instructors for their picks. One professor chimed in saying, aside from the top-tier candidate number 5, 217 and 753 really caught his eye. Another professor suggested keeping that short and sweet, since adding more names would be like inviting more trouble. The first professor nodded and asked if anyone wanted to challenge that notion. The meeting rolled on. Eventually, the head honcho declared they had confirmed the lucky ones for the swordsmanship course. But then a voice piped up asking about candidate number 513. The head turned to see it was Professor Ariel, the inquisitive one. She wanted to know everyone's take on candidate 513. They all turned to the screen to see. One professor dubbed 513 as the little guy. As they watched, it seemed like he was fighting his way to the top. But if he was banking on traps to outsmart the examiner, he was about to. Sure, his technique looked snazzy, but his muscle power was as weak as a wet noodle from the get-go. The brown-haired professor with a mustache declared he was less than stellar. They all nodded like bobbleheads in agreement. Professor Ariel was at a loss for words. She couldn't believe so many had tuned in, but missed the memo. If everyone was that clueless, then having a group watch party was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. The next day, Gray clutched his exam ticket like it was a golden ticket. The swordsmanship course results were about to pop up. Only 6 lucky ducks made it through. The tension in the air was thicker than molasses. The first candidate called was number 5. As their number echoed, their exam ticket went up in flames. Then came 217. Next were 432 and 615. Then it was 753 and 925. That was all she wrote. Gray felt like he'd been punched in the gut when his number didn't get a shout-out. The successful candidates were instructed to waddle over the bridge and finish their enrollment by day's end. Gray felt like a sad puppy while everyone around him cheered for the winners. He wore a heartbroken face like a kid who just dropped their ice cream. Then came the surprise announcement, the Divine Eye special admission. Just moments later, Gray's number was called, and his exam ticket went up in blue flames. The crowd gasped like they'd seen a ghost. Gray stood stock still, utterly baffled. The murmurings in the crowd turned into sneers. This was Gray's first encounter with this mystical special admission. Some folks were convinced the Academy had pulled a fast one. They claimed the World Union Academy had hit a new low. Gray's ears perked up as he overheard the chatter. He was as confused as a dog at a cat show, wondering if his master worked some magic, but nothing came to mind. An older gentleman scolded the crowd for their thoughts on the Divine Eye admission, like a parent reprimanding kids for talking back. He proclaimed it a prestigious path that had churned out heroes for eons. The crowd wasn't buying it. They pointed fingers at recent Divine Eye selections, Amy White, Bella Albbright, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield, and claimed they were flops. Even the current candidates had caught wind of the tales. But Gray wasn't swayed. He knew those three were part of the A-team that fought against the big bad Liquidator. Now his name had joined their ranks. An announcement rang through the academy that the entrance ceremony would kick off in 30 minutes. Once the students whipped themselves into shape, they were asked to congregate in the plaza in front of the main office. Their uniforms were sharp, with a black path etched with the academy symbol. Our MC looked like $1,000,000. A handful of students showed up a tad early to the plaza, but confusion reigned as nothing seemed set up yet. Suddenly, a man sprinted toward them, apologizing like he'd just tripped over his own feet, explaining a mix-up had occurred. He asked the students to step back a smidgen so he could sort out the staircase situation. The students shuffled back, asking if their current spot was good. The man gave them a thumbs up. Then he dropped to his knees like he was trying out for a superhero role. The students stared baffled. He laid his hands on the ground and poof, a massive magic circle appeared. The floor began to rumble and the students' jaws hit the floor. They watched slack-jawed as a whole structure emerged right before their eyes. The man apologized once more for the hiccup and told them they could sit wherever tickled their fancy. The students, wide-eyed and amazed, realized it was teleportation magic, but it was hard to wrap their heads around the fact that something so massive could be zapped around. Gray plopped down. The entrance ceremony was set to kick off in 30 minutes. Once the students wrapped up their costume changes, they were rounded up to convene at the plaza by the main office. Their uniforms sported a slick black path, featuring the Academy's emblem. Our hero was looking sharp. A few students showed up early to the plaza, but they were kind of scratching their heads, unsure if they were in the right place, since nada was set up yet. Suddenly, a man came sprinting toward them, apologizing for the holdup, saying there had been a mix-up. He told the students to step back a scooch so he could plop down the stairs right there. The students shifted and asked if where they were standing was cool. The man reassured them it was spot on. Then he bent down. The students exchanged puzzled looks. He touched the ground and bam! A gigantic magic circle popped up. The ground started to shimmy and shake. The students' jaws hit the floor. They were flabbergasted as a whole structure rose up right in front of them. The man apologized once more for the delay and said they could plop down wherever they fancied. The students were totally blown away. They realized it was teleportation magic, but they just couldn't fathom how something so massive could be teleported. Gray plopped down. He thought the school probably wanted the ceremony in a spot where everyone could ogle the fancy building. To him, it felt like they were showing off their teleportation magic skills. He was definitely buzzing with excitement after realizing just how awesome the World Union Academy really was. The students noticed there were way too many seats. With only 30 students accepted, having that many chairs seemed a bit excessive. The girl she was chatting with was shocked she didn't know why. She shrugged and said aside from sword training, she hadn't really hit the books much. The girl jumped at the chance to explain. She said that just as the name implies, the academy pulls in the top-notch students from all over the globe. Then she pointed up at something in the sky. The other girl's jaw dropped as she spotted aircraft and dragons zooming around above. She asked, "What in the world are those?" Gray's eyes widened at the sight of the magical airship Strato Queen. He'd hopped aboard it once before when he signed up with the Liquidator subjugation squad. Rumor had it that it was one of the largest airships swirling around the planet. He couldn't wrap his head around them using that thing just for an entrance ceremony. The World Union Academy was clearly blowing all of Gray's expectations out of the water. The airship touched down and the students began to disembark. Finally, everyone had arrived, and with that, the entrance ceremony could kick off. After what felt like an eternity, the headmaster finally wrapped up his speech. Gray was zoning out. To him, the entrance ceremony felt just like any other boring one. Next up was the part where the top students of each course would be introduced. Leon Hart, the creme de la creme of the swordsmanship course, was called up. As he stood up and strutted onto the stage, the students couldn't help but gossip. They heard he had taken down the examiner in a blink during the entrance exam. Some even claimed he was as skilled as any of the professors when it came to wielding a sword. This dude was Leonhard Apius, and Gray watched him closely. Just before he grabbed the microphone, he checked with the heads if he could speak his mind. They nodded, and he thanked them. Then he threw out a complaint he wanted to lodge against the academy. Before diving deeper into that, he made sure to properly greet his classmates and everyone who had just been admitted. He said it was an honor to be alongside the rest of them at the academy. He told everyone they should walk away as individuals capable of genuinely contributing to the world, so he urged them to join forces. He added he couldn't wait for the days when they could set their sights high together as students of the renowned World Union Academy. However, he did hint that some of them probably didn't deserve to be there. Then he turned to Professor Ariel and asked if he was right. She was taken aback. She said all the students present passed the tough exams, and even if they weren't as strong as him, excluding them didn't seem like a bright idea. Then she asked him why he was asking her that. Leonhart shot her a glare and clarified he wasn't talking about the folks who legitimately earned their spot by passing the exams. What he really meant was the students who got a special ticket into the academy through backdoor channels. He then dared the specially admitted student to step forward and ordered him to return his uniform and skedaddle from the academy. The air was thick with tension. Gray was baffled by his hostility. Then it hit him that Leonhart was sitting right next to him. He thanked his lucky stars that the guy didn't recognize his face. Just a little longer, and he hoped he wouldn't get dragged into this mess if he stayed under the radar. Professor Ariel commented that the students this year were quite spicy. Leonhart felt like nobody was taking him seriously. He called her out for allowing students to waltz in through the back door. At first, she didn't say much. Then, in a rapid move, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, asking if he genuinely thought he was stronger than that kid. Her unexpected maneuver left the entire crowd dumbfounded. Leonhart looked flustered. He gritted his teeth, said yes, and asked if she was trying to challenge his confidence. Professor Ariel loved his boldness and proposed a bet. That caught his attention. She wagered both her job and the kid's admission. Gray was completely perplexed by the whirlwind of craziness unfolding. Leonhart swung his attention back to Professor Ariel, asking if she was really trying to push him into a showdown with the special admission kid. Professor Ariel calmly said she would never engage in something so dull. She added that if Gray gave it his all, Leonhart would be in lots of trouble. As a responsible teacher, she wasn't about to put anyone's life on the line. Leonhart was fuming veins, bulging with rage. He felt insulted, but she simply pointed out she was only speaking the truth. Instead, she proposed a safer alternative, a bet involving monsters. She pointed out that Leonhart was much better at battling monsters than humans anyway. He glared at her, but couldn't help but acknowledge that she knew him well. He then asked what the actual bet entailed. She laid it out plainly. Each of them would take on a monster of her choosing. The monsters would ramp up in strength for each round. Whoever couldn't defeat their monster first would lose the stakes. If Gray lost, Professor Ariel would retire, and the special admission students would be sent packing. But if Leonhart lost, he'd be at her mercy for whatever she ordered him to do. Then she asked if he was in. Leonhart needed to know what kind of monsters they would be facing. He felt confident in his skills, but he didn't want to step into anything bizarre. After mulling it over for a moment, she revealed the first target, an ogre general. Then she cheekily asked if that was a little too easy for him. The whole class gasped, but Gray remained unfazed. Instead, he was itching to know why she picked that particular beast. Leonhart, meanwhile, was better at fighting monsters than humans. He scowled at her, but admitted she really understood him. He asked again what the actual bet would entail. She explained it simply to avoid any more confusion. Each of them would take on a monster she selected. The monsters would grow tougher with each round. The first person to struggle against their monster would end up losing everything. If Gray lost, Professor Ariel would step down, and all the special admission students would have to hit the road. But if Leonhart lost, he'd be forced to follow her orders. Then she clarified, did he want in? Leon Hart was eager to know what kind of monsters they'd have to grapple with. He felt good about his combat skills, but wanted to steer clear of any weird surprises. After a thoughtful pause, she dropped the first bomb, an ogre general. Then she playfully asked if that would be too much of a walk in the park for him. The entire class was left speechless, but Gray's curiosity was piqued about her choice of monster. Leon Hart, on the other hand, then she playfully asked if that was too much of a cakewalk for him. The entire class gawked, but Gray was unfazed. Instead, he was curious about her choice of that particular monster. On the flip side, Leon Hart he was seeing red. He yelled that there was no way anyone could take down an ogre general on their own. Professor Ariel coolly reminded him that they weren't in a hurry. They had a whole year to figure this out. Leon Hart was not having any of it. If someone could tackle a disaster-level monster all by themselves in just a year, then folks wouldn't be crying in their cereal. He shouted at her to aim for something that was actually achievable. Gasping for air, he paused and suddenly caught on to her clever scheme. He figured she was intentionally picking an impossible task just to keep things fair and square. But with swagger, he announced he wasn't going to play her game. Ariel grinned mischievously and tossed in one final twist. If the match ended in a stalemate, Leon Hart automatically became the champ. Basically, if Gray flopped against the ogre general, she'd be out of a job, and all the special students would be kicked to the curb. She asked him how he felt about that. He looked at her as if she'd grown two heads. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a total setup. She took his silence as a thumbs up just to clarify. He said it better not be a softy version of an ogre general or something. She replied with a chill, "No problem." Then with a snap of her fingers, a feather pen appeared as if by magic. She told him the terms were already scribbled in a magical contract, and he could sign if he wasn't throwing a fit. He skimmed the contract and decided to roll with it. Still, he had to wonder, did she honestly think that kid stood a chance? Her answer was all smoke and mirrors. She said, "Who really knows?" Then she quietly plopped back into her seat. The other professors were buzzing like bees, all speculating what was up with her. Some guessed she was just using this whole bet as a sneaky way to retire. Not too far-fetched, considering she was definitely on the downhill slide. Now, Gray had no way out. The bet was locked in. But one thing kept gnawing at him. Why did she have to include the one he had already beaten before? The enrollment when she blabbed about a whole year. She simply watched our hero in silence. Gray knew the deal was sealed the moment it kicked off. As he stared at her, she put a finger to her lips, signaling him to zip it. That's when Gray realized she was playing dirty. Eventually, the opening ceremony wrapped up, and everyone shuffled off to their assigned classes. First up was basic magic. Some were caught off guard that they jumped into lectures right away on day one, but as academy students, they had to understand that every single day counted. The professor kicked off the lesson by explaining how to wield magic. It was the most basic of topics. He emphasized that the body contains a hidden energy called ether, and taught them how to channel it through their magic circuits. He kept scribbling and explaining on the board. Gray was in this class and initially worried he might fall behind, but it turned out he was already familiar with this stuff from boot camp. So far so good, but here's the kicker of all the classes, he ended up in the same one as Leon Hart. He silently prayed Leon wouldn't discover he was the Divine Eye's special admission student. The professor caught Gray zoning out. He gave him a tongue lashing for already drifting off just 5 minutes into the lecture. Gray couldn't believe he got busted while sitting at the back of the room. He quickly apologized. The professor challenged him. If he looked that sure of himself, why not show off in front of the class? He even teased him, expecting him to use some basic magic. Gray politely pointed out that since this was a swordsmanship course, it was totally cool if they couldn't whip up magic. The professor shot back that even if you primarily swing a sword in battle, knowing the basics of magic is crucial. You gotta learn how to jive with the mages. Understanding basic spells and how they feel is a must. Gray was shocked the professor was dropping the same knowledge he got in boot camp. He wondered if the spell they'd be learning would also sound familiar, so he asked if they were going to master Ether Bullet. The professor raised an eyebrow and asked if he could already pull it off. Gray answered with a confident yes. He felt a wave of relief. At least the grueling boot camp hadn't been a total waste. Sensing the moment, the professor decided to set up a little showdown. He knew Leon Hart, whom he fondly called Leon, could also use Ether Bullet. Leon Hart confirmed it, adding that even before stepping foot in the academy, he had trained in both swordplay and magic, making it a risky business for anyone else to go toe-to-toe with him. But the professor didn't sweat it. He claimed even with the skill gap they were just firing ether bullets for practice. It's not like anyone would be sending each other to the hospital. And he wasn't planning on having Leon hold back either. Then the professor dropped a bombshell. He announced that Gray was the Divine Eye student for the year. Eyes from all corners turned to stare at Gray. He realized he was in hot water now. The professor was grinning like a Cheshire cat as he laid everything out. Leon Hart shot a cold look at him. He declared he would show Gray how things were really done, and what kind of joint this academy truly was. Leon Hart's gaze bored into Gray as he commanded him to step forward. They faced off. The professor explained that once he gave the word they would blast their ether bullets at each other. Gray had only dabbled in magic for a few days during boot camp, and even though the professor reassured him it wouldn't be lethal, he knew there was a good chance he'd walk away with some bruises. And the professor shouted the signal to start. Leon Hart was hell-bent on proving he was the top dog. Gray had no choice but to throw caution to the wind. Leon Hart launched a small baby blue orb of light. But when Gray whipped up his spell, a huge glowing blue orb popped into existence right in front of him. The next moment, jaws dropped across the board, faces frozen in disbelief. Even our hero couldn't believe it himself. Gray's ether bullet overpowered Leonhardt's attempt. It sent Leonhardt howling in panic. The professor jumped in with a barrier in front of Leonhardt to shield him. He breathed a sigh of relief for saving him. But to their shock, the barrier totally tanked. It shattered into tiny pieces, sending Leonhardt flying. It kicked up a mad gust of wind and blinding light. Other students were caught in the crossfire. Leonhardt let out an ear-splitting scream as he crashed to the ground. The professor bolted to his side, asking if he was all right. Leonhardt dusted himself off and said he was fine. The professor exhaled, relieved. Then he turned his gaze to Gray. He realized if the barrier hadn't dulled the blow, Leonhardt could have bitten the dust. Even crazier, none of the professors could conjure an ether bullet that powerful. He faced Gray and asked, "What on earth did you just pull off?" Gray looked puzzled. Leonhardt's ether bullet had felt like it was packing air, not even close to the same spell. This made him wonder, was the ether bullet he picked up during his subjugation squad time different from what they taught at the academy? He asked if he might have used the wrong spell. The professor replied, "Nope, it was absolutely an ether bullet." But he added that Gray's was in a league of its own. It wasn't made from regular ether. It was super compressed ether. The other students were entirely clueless about that. The professor admitted that it was a kind of power even they found tricky to handle. Yet here was Gray not just producing it, but shaping it into a spell. He declared there was no one else in the whole academy who could pull that off. The students started murmuring. It was the first time they'd ever seen an ether bullet so potent. Some folks began to believe that Divine Eye admission was real for this reason. Others insisted Gray should have been in the magic course from day one, instead of being treated like a special case. But in Gray's head, something felt a bit off. All the spells he learned at boot camp were like that, and even among his squad, he wasn't seen as some sort of magic whiz. He asked the professor if he was just pulling his leg, because with enough elbow grease, anyone could manage that right. The professor burst out laughing. Gray was left scratching his head, especially when the professor let out an even heartier laugh. Then, out of the blue, the professor grabbed him by the shoulders, invading his personal bubble, and insisted he should transfer to the magic course. He even went as far as to personally vouch for him. According to the professor, Gray was more talented at magic than sword fighting. Gray politely turned it down, saying he had always been told he lacked magical flair. The professor looked at him like he just told a knee slapper. He couldn't believe Gray, who grasped the ether compression technique well enough to whip up super compressed ether, thought he didn't have what it takes. He called Gray a once-in-a-lifetime genius, someone even the academy would label a prodigy. He added that whoever told him he had no magical talent clearly didn't have a clue. Then he asked again, "Are you absolutely certain you don't want to switch to the magic course?" The professor was known for rarely handing out compliments. The students were absolutely gobsmacked. They couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that he was showering someone with so much praise. He kept hammering away at Gray, insisting that if someone like him didn't dive into the world of magic, it would be a tragedy for the planet, and even labeled it a crime against magic itself. Gray let out a nervous chuckle, and then it hit him. He suddenly recalled where he'd heard about the ether compression technique before. Back in his previous life at boot camp, someone once spilled the beans that in the ancient days, folks didn't even know the oddball stuff, also known as life force, was a thing. Because of that, conjuring up legit magic was like trying to teach a cat to swim. You had to squish ether into your system and pray a little spark would mix with some random weird stuff to whip up a spell. This lady with baby blue hair and shiny golden eyes called that whole process a joke. Fast forward to now, Gray casually asked the professor if he'd ever heard of odd, and the professor looked as lost as a tourist in a corn maze. That expression said it all. This world had no clue about that thing's existence. Gray had a light bulb moment. What he learned in the badass subjugation squad was way ahead of its time, and he totally needed to keep his mouth zipped. The professor circled back to the magic course question, asking if Gray was still on board. With a grand bow that would impress a knight, Gray said thanks, but no thanks. He confessed that swords were his one true love. As much as he appreciated the magic offer, it was a hard pass. The professor took it like a champ, saying Gray was welcome back any time if he had a change of heart. Gray expressed his heartfelt gratitude, and the prof told him to take a seat. Plus, from now on, he wouldn't give Gray the stink eye for zoning out or bolting early, since this class was as basic as a two-piece puzzle for him. The other students were practically gasping. They couldn't believe Professor Carlos was singing Gray's praises like he was a rock star. Meanwhile, Leonhardt was eyeing Gray like he was a golden nugget. He clutched his chest cheeks, tinged pink, practically swooning as he called him Lord Gray. Gray felt a shiver run down his spine. It was honestly a smidge creepy. Later that day, he got a note from Professor Ariel inviting him to her office after class. That was a plot twist. The summons hit him like a cold bucket of water. He couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with Professor Carlos. Maybe she was plotting to suggest he jump ship to the magic course. As he reached her office, he found himself staring at her door. Just as he was about to knock, Professor Ariel shouted from inside, saying it wasn't locked. He walked in only to be blindsided by a surprise attack. In a flash, he whipped out his sword and blocked her strike like a seasoned pro. The girl who lunged at him looked shocked. Gray realized he had reacted purely on reflex, but now he was dying to know what on earth made her attack him. Then he got a good glimpse of her face and nearly dropped his sword. She looked eerily familiar, like a déjà vu at a family reunion. Someone at the table chimed in saying he did awesome. It was Professor Ariel, and Gray had just confirmed her instincts were spot on. A guy next to her wondered if Bella was actually holding back. He had to check if Professor Ariel had given her the green light to go soft. Sure, her moves were on point, but having her sword swatted away like a pesky fly seemed a bit sketchy. Hearing her name, Gray confirmed that she was indeed Bella Albbright. She was the Grand Sorceress, no less. Professor Ariel couldn't believe the two guys were seriously discussing this. She suggested that if they couldn't figure out if Bella was pulling punches, maybe they should just hang up their professor hats. The other professor joked that they were just kidding. Since he lost their little wager, he begrudgingly handed over some coins. Gray couldn't help but ask what the fuss was about. Ariel explained they were betting on whether he could dodge Bella's surprise assault or not, and thanks to him, she raked in some serious cash. Then she tossed him his share. His jaw hit the floor when he saw the gold coin. It was practically a gold brick. The other professor couldn't help but comment that it was exactly as Ariel said. They noticed how Gray had handled that exchange earlier. He consciously avoided using his dormant arm like he was guarding a secret treasure. One professor speculated it might be due to an injury. The other suggested it felt less like a simple muscle sprain and more like a serious mental boo-boo. The professors nodded, agreeing that an ordinary injury wouldn't cause such a fuss. Gray was flabbergasted that they could tell all that just by looking. The professors shot back that if they couldn't spot that much, they wouldn't be wearing their fancy professor badges. Meanwhile, Ariel said she was already in the loop during the exam. She told them to scram now that they were in the know. She assured the professors conceded that Gray had potential, but if that injury didn't heal, it still meant he might not make the cut to get into the academy in the first place. Before they left, they reminded him to keep that in mind, and then they were out of there. With the distractions gone, Professor Ariel segued into a convo about magic over some tea. She mentioned hearing he had used super-compressed ether in Professor Carlos's class. He was taken aback that she already knew that she added that Carlos had come to her office asking her to hand Gray over to the magic course. Naturally, she said no because, in her eyes, he was way better suited for whipping a sword than casting spells. Our main guy didn't expect that to come from her. She tossed in that he didn't seem like a magic compression whiz, and he wasn't exactly oozing signs of practice. He was dumbfounded that she could see right through him like that, so he decided to keep it real and admitted she was spot on. She asked what kind of trick he pulled off, promising she wouldn't spill the beans and would even toss in a reward. She really needed to know for Bella's sake. He was nearly dubbed the sorceress himself. Professor Ariel explained that Bella was a whiz when it came to magic theory, but her wand skills were a hot mess. For some reason, she just couldn't master the ether compression technique, and that's why she was struggling to create super compressed ether. Gray remembered hearing Bella was a late bloomer before. Then Professor Ariel continued sharing that according to Carlos, when Gray used super compressed ether, it didn't even look like he was compressing ether at all. So, if there's a way to wield super compressed ether without the whole compressing bit, Bella could dodge being sent to Professor Varian. Gray raised an eyebrow, asking if she meant Professor Varian Bradley. She realized he was onto her. Well, it's hard not to know him, given his infamy. After all, the guy's practically a horror story, conducting twisted experiments on humans and leaving a trail of bodies behind. Even worse, his magic disasters have caused the death toll to skyrocket into the tens of thousands. He's basically the worst magic criminal in history. Gray was shocked that this dude was still roaming free. Professor Ariel explained that if Bella couldn't manage to create super_compressed ether by year's end, she'd be on a one-way trip to him for a little surgery. Gray couldn't believe his ears. That sounded like a recipe for disaster. Professor Ariel nodded in agreement. Although that surgery was sold to the public as a way to boost her magical prowess, it was really just high-stakes human experimentation. People were whispering that some had died or come out scarred for life because of him. Bella spoke up, shivering as she muttered it was dangerous and terrifying, yet she'd be booted from the academy by year's end if she couldn't nail down super compressed ether. Professor Ariel voiced her hopes that Bella would choose to leave the academy rather than let that creep mess with her. The magic Gray was aware of was knowledge that hadn't yet found its time. If he divulged it, he could shake things up in a way history may never recover from. He caught sight of Bella trembling, and it brought back memories of his encounter with the Liquidator, reminding him of the helplessness he felt. He realized that some folks had kicked the bucket and others were left as emotional wrecks. Bella said it was all super risky and scary, but she had to get her act together or risk getting booted from the academy by year's end if she couldn't master super compressed ether. Professor Ariel confessed she kind of wished she'd thrown in the towel at the academy instead of letting that guy toy with her body. The magic that Gray was privy to was from the future. If he spilled the beans, he might mess up the timeline. He saw Bella trembling, which reminded him of his run-in with the Liquidator and feeling utterly powerless. He told them he might just rewrite history. He noticed Bella shaking like a leaf, and it brought back memories of his earlier run-in with the Liquidator, where he felt utterly powerless. It dawned on him that there's no point in sharing when that dreadful future place could use a makeover. He assured her that he got it and promised to show her how to handle super compressed ether come dusk in the arena. He scribbled some notes on the board. It was everything he knew about magic, and he reminded them of their sacred pact not to spill the beans on his newfound secrets. Professor Ariel confirmed they were on the same page. They even sealed the deal with a magic contract, and if they breached it, poof, they'd be gone. He asked them for their 2 cents on his revelations. Professor Ariel confessed that just hearing about OD was mind-blowing. But the magic knowledge he dropped was next level. Bella chimed in that it was a short yet brilliantly organized lecture. To her, it felt like she was attending a magical course from the future, like way into the future. Just hearing his take has absolutely catapulted the history of magic forward by a century. In his mind, he thought it came from her lecture a decade ahead, but he realized it must sound like a century's leap to someone living back then. Professor Ariel mentioned that there was so much info she couldn't quite wrap her head around. She asked Bella if she believed what he said was legit. Bella answered that there's a solid chance the theory holds up and none of it clashes with the current magic doctrine. Plus, the fastest way to find out was to put it to the test. That's exactly why they were there. If everything Gray said was spot on, the spell should work. She handed them the copy. He skimmed it and was utterly baffled. She conjured a light from her staff to showcase her full might according to the theory. If his memory served right, Bella's full power could toast an entire city. But rumor had it, she struggled to rein in her raw magic energy. Before he could ponder more, her magic surged. Even Bella looked a little lost. And then, bam! Her power exploded forth like the 4th of July. Nobody saw that much mana coming from her. It was power like nobody had ever witnessed. If she hadn't wrangled it back a split second before he'd be toast, she literally saved his skin. Meanwhile, Bella was on cloud 9 that she nailed it, and she managed to keep it under control. She crafted a magical dragon and had a blast doing it, but she was out of ether and passed out. Gray freaked out, but Professor Ariel reassured him to chill. Bella just crashed because she tapped out of ether. She told him to let her snooze. Gray exhaled in relief. Professor Ariel couldn't help but marvel at her talent. She whipped up magic of that caliber in no time. Even in her sleep, Bella retorted that it wasn't her genius. It was all thanks to the theory. Because of it, she could whip up a super compressed ether with ease. In Gray's head, he thought it's actually her theory. But hey, he kept that to himself. Professor Ariel felt relieved that Bella wouldn't need surgery anymore, now that she could generate super compressed ether. She meant to call Bradley to cancel the surgery. She was thrilled about that, but even more pleased that Bella held on to her magic control. Gray was curious about that. She elaborated that while variant surgery can jack up magical output, it comes at the price of losing control. The nitty-gritty of it is a closely guarded secret, but it kicks your limits to the curb. That made Gray think that maybe that's why some sorceresses in history struggled with controlling their mighty magic. That surgery. Professor Ariel pointed out it's thanks to Gray that Bella now wields a super compressed ether. With that, they fulfilled the contract, and it was her turn to uphold her end. The first thing on her agenda was to work her magic on his arm. When she released her magic, magical butterflies fluttered out to play. She touched his hand, and the butterflies danced around them. The magic kicked up a notch. Once she was done, she asked how he felt. He clenched his hand. To his surprise, he could actually move it. He was grateful and puzzled, because not even a magical healing potion managed to fix it. She advised him not to compare her nerve-restoring magic with regular healing potions. Then she inquired if he could move his hand like before. She suggested he swing a sword to test the waters. Our guy stepped back and took a swing. He was a bit perplexed initially, so he kept swinging. It felt weird. It didn't seem to move like it used to. She mentioned that while she fixed his nerves, her magic couldn't heal the wounds in his soul. He asked her to unpack that a bit. She emphasized that he heard her right. Then she added that recent discoveries in magic haven't confirmed the existence of the soul yet, but she believes it's there. After all, she can see it with her own eyes. She could see his soul healing up slowly. It would mend naturally as long as he didn't overdo it. He mulled it over and asked if he should lay off the sword practice. She said it was fine to train like usual. She was actually intrigued about what kind of swordplay could damage one's soul like that. He was left speechless. Then she pointed out that there's already a sword style that uses one's soul to command the sword. She was talking about Amy White. She figured he already knew about her. Gray was puzzled as to why she brought up the Sword Saint then. They hadn't even crossed paths in that time. Due to his silence, Professor Ariel wondered if she misstepped. She mentioned that his swordsmanship gave her vibes like he learned it from Amy. Reflecting on it, she caught some slight distinctions. It got her thinking that. She told him that the way he swung his sword made it seem like he'd learned it from Amy herself. But then she noticed a slight twist and thought it was odd. The person he learned swordsmanship from must have been way more talented than Amy. She suggested that if he gives it a few more years, Amy might just catch up to his master's level. Gray was blown away that she could even think that far ahead. He chimed in saying that he picked up swordsmanship at a dojo back in his hometown. At this point, he had to steer the conversation elsewhere because if he kept talking, he might spill all his secrets. So he popped the question about whether swordsmanship could mess up someone's soul. She quickly shot back, "Not a chance. At least not with any kind of swordsmanship. I mean, let's be real, there's just no way that something as ordinary could take down an ogre general with a single slice. Plus, it'd also have to chop down the surrounding ogres and trees like they were just popcorn. Gray put two and two together and realized she already knew the score. Of course she did. Thanks to him, she was already gloating about winning the bet. She admitted to catching glimpses of the remaining scenes, and boy did they look epic. Not even the fanciest cleaving magic could pull that off, which led her to conclude he must have tapped into some mysterious power lurking within him. Curious, he asked if she could see it with her own eyes. She raised an eyebrow and confidently said, yes. She could see the power leaking through the chain door. This reminded him of that door he had seen before. It's not exactly something you guess, so he was convinced she could actually see it. Then she casually mentioned she had seen a power like his, though she didn't think they were the exact same thing, just had a similar vibe. He probed if there were others with powers like his. She nodded and said yes, but also spilled that she wasn't entirely sure if they were human or not. Then she dropped a bombshell. They called them Liquidators, and seeing his expression, she knew he had heard of them before. He was scratching his head, wondering why that name was popping up right now. Professor Ariel realized he was already in the loop. Honestly, she hadn't thought it was that famous. She pointed out that since Gray knew about some future-seeking magic theory, it wasn't all that shocking. He just chuckled, thinking it was indeed knowledge from the future that was flying over everyone's heads. She asked how much he knew about the Liquidators. He replied that he'd heard they were a major threat to humanity and needed to be stopped before they showed up. If stopping wasn't an option, then he had to be taken out no matter the cost. She thought he was a bit over the top, but agreed that they were dangerous. But still, Vian was all fired up about his experiments. Gray inquired how Professor Vian tied into all this. She looked puzzled at his question, but then revealed that the Liquidator was the very being he was trying to summon. That was news to him. He had no idea they made the Liquidator. But recalling the Academy's last antics, they acted like they had a crystal ball to know exactly when the Liquidator would show up. Then it hit him like a sack of potatoes. He freaked out that the Academy had been involved in the summoning all along. He yelled that this experiment had to be shut down right away, and Professor Ariel nodded in agreement. But here's the kicker. She couldn't pull the plug because the person in charge was another professor, just like her. She pushed the higher-ups to cancel it, but they had their ears closed. Gray interrogated who those higher-ups even were. She didn't have the clearance to spill that juice either. She summed it up that unless orders came from the top, no one could stop the experiment. He felt deflated that he couldn't even get a name. He realized the Academy's hierarchy was more tangled than spaghetti at an Italian restaurant. But if that person turned out to be a criminal, then game on. In the last world, Vian's shady experiments wiped out tens of thousands, and he knew exactly where all that madness went down. He blurted out that he knew Professor Varian was behind those illegal experiments, and he'd thought about catching him in the act. But Professor Ariel warned him that wouldn't work either. He asked why not. She explained that barging into an Academy professor's research lab without permission was a serious crime, and if they couldn't whip up hard evidence, they'd be the ones behind bars. Now she flipped the script and asked if he had proof of those crimes. He fell silent. She kept going, saying that if he didn't, they needed to table this convo for now. It dawned on him that she understood how dangerous this was, and her hands were tied. He simply told her he got it. Then she switched gears and asked if he wanted to learn how to control his power. That perked his interest right up. He asked if she could really help with that. She said there's a professor in the Academy who's excellent at handling unknown forces, Heathcote Longfellow. He recognized that name. It was the same guy who trained the Sword Saint herself. She was clearly pleased to have grabbed his attention, so she planned to set him up for some private training starting tomorrow. He was over the moon about it. The main reason he came to the Academy was to master his powers, and he didn't expect to catch a break that quickly. Then came the next day, and Heathcote Longfellow was on him like white on rice. He couldn't believe he was receiving personal training from the man himself, but the puzzlement hit him as to why they were just sprinting around in the forest. Even though Heathcote was ahead, Gray's thoughts were clearly wandering off. He hollered at him, saying if his mind was full of distractions, he better pick up the pace. He instructed him to run until his body hit its breaking point. He yelled for him to focus, then lectured that only after burning every ounce of physical strength would his soul's power begin to wake up. She piqued his interest. Gray asked if she was serious, and she responded that there was a professor at the Academy who was a pro at handling all kinds of strange forces. The guy's name, Heathcote Longfellow. He recognized that name. That dude trained the legendary sword saint. She figured it would grab his attention, so she planned to set him up for private lessons starting tomorrow. Gray was buzzing with excitement. He'd come to the academy aiming to harness power and didn't expect to find a lead that quickly. But the next day, Heathcote Longfellow came at him like a whirlwind. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that he was getting personal training from the legendary Heathcote. But seriously, why were they just chasing each other around the forest like it was a game of tag? Even if Heathcote was fast, Gray's mind was drifting like a balloon in the wind. Heathcote hollered at him, saying if he had room for daydreams, he better pick up the slack. He bellowed at him to push until he was running on fumes. While Gray was panting, Heathcote gave him a lecture that he needed to burn through every bit of physical energy to unlock his soul's true power. And as long as he had even a smidgen of energy left in the tank, swords would stay firmly out of reach. He responded, "Yes, sir." He trusted that since it was Heathcote's training regime, it must be for a good reason. But it bugged him that while he was out there running laps like a headless chicken, Varian was busy trying to summon the Arbiter. They kept running while he kept wondering if he should really be doing that at this very moment. Later that day, he made his way to Professor Ariel. She seemed to know full well that a week had gone by in training already. She asked how it was going. He said it mostly consisted of running with a sprinkle of sword drills at the end. He confessed he felt stronger though. She chuckled, saying, "Sounds just like you," as they were chatting. Someone gave a knock on the door. The person then handed Professor Ariel a letter. She read it, and her face turned into a summer squash gone bad. He asked what the hullabaloo was about. She handed him the letter, and after reading it, his face mirrored her look of discontent. The letter to Professor Ariel was about Bella, who had pulled off some super-duper ether compression and apparently gained a power. But upon closer inspection, it was clear that she hadn't actually compressed it at all, so her shiny new ability couldn't be called super-compressed ether after all. This meant their contract was still in play, and the surgery would proceed as scheduled. It was from Vian Bradley. Gray was fuming. He hollered, "This is absolute madness." Professor Ariel could sense Vian was hell-bent on dragging her into surgery, whether she needed it or not. He asked if Bella had any way to say no. She said, regrettably, Bella's only options were to get booted or go under the knife. Gray was not having it. She said she needed his help. She wanted to know where Vian's lab was because if they exposed him as a crook, the contract would become worthless. He was taken aback for a moment, but then grinned. He reminded her what she had previously said. It was dangerous without some solid proof. She replied that they would dig up evidence. She placed her trust in him. Reflecting on their earlier conversations, she realized she could have done that from the get-go because her gut told her he was being honest the whole time. It just took her a while to acknowledge it. She insisted he show her the way, and together they would drag Vian's dirty laundry into the light. Gray let Professor Ariel know that Varian's lab was perched in the mountains near the village of Torowell. She recalled that he had an Academy-approved lab up there. He couldn't believe Varian was pulling off illegal experiments in such a legit sound. She told him there's no better hideout for sneaky experiments than that spot. Nobody would bat an eye, even if he camped out there for ages. Plus, no professor from the Academy would dare mess with another's lab. But as long as they collected proof of his antics, they wouldn't be charged with breaking in. Suddenly, Bella knocked on the door. Professor Ariel welcomed her inside. Bella announced she received the letter. Professor Ariel took it from her and assured her not to worry because she would handle it. Bella was about to ask what exactly she meant. She wanted to know if the professor was really going to duke it out with Varian for her sake. She also asked if she was going to tackle it all by herself. Professor Ariel found it amusing. Then she said she was plenty capable on her own. Bella turned to Gray. Gray told the professor to hold up because he was joining the party too. Bella wanted in as well since this was her mess. She reminded them to slow their roll because they would be going head-to-head with an academy professor. Not to mention he was a nutcase who had a penchant for conducting dodgy human experiments. If he laid his hands on any of them who knew what he would do, she couldn't let the two of them rush into such a pickle. Gray pointed out that the more reason there was to not go solo. If he unleashed the same power he did to topple the Ogre General, he could actually be a help. He added that if Professor Ariel vanished, he as a student with a Divine Eye admission could end up kicked out. Hearing that made her shudder. He requested they be allowed to choose their own destinies. The professor studied them and let out a sigh. She knew they would still go even if she tried to stop them. She agreed to let them tag along on one condition, that no matter what went down, they had to prioritize their safety first. She asked if they got it. They answered, absolutely. Later that night in the mountains, there was a hidden laboratory, and Professor Ariel, Bella, and Gray stood hidden in front of it. Bella was in disbelief that Varian was really conducting illegal experiments there. Professor Ariel confirmed it, and their mission was to sniff out the dirt. Gray also made sure this was the right location, after they said that Bella put her faith in them. But she hesitated if they could actually gather evidence without running into trouble. Professor Ariel expected Varian to be at the Magic Society's conference, so they were in luck. However, the entrance likely had traps rigged up, so they needed to break in through the side wall. Bella wondered if that was really a good idea. Professor Ariel replied that busting into an Academy-approved lab was already a crime, so they might as well have fun doing it. She told them if they had second thoughts, they were free to skedaddle, but she was all in. Before they pushed ahead, she turned to Professor Ariel and asked if she was really committed to helping someone like her. Gray chimed in saying she was mistaken because halting the experiment was about saving the whole world. If they don't, they were breaking the law. Right in that very spot, Professor Ariel confirmed that was the plan to dig up some dirt. Gray agreed. It was definitely the place. Bella was on board, but a bit skittish about collecting evidence without crashing and burning. The professor thought Varian was off at the Magic Society's conference so they could sneak in. Unfortunately, the entrance might be booby-trapped, so they were planning to bust in through a side wall. Bella was concerned if that was a solid plan. Professor Ariel shrugged, saying, hey, breaking into an Academy's authorized lab was already a crime, so why not? She told them if they had second thoughts, they could back out now, but she was going. Before they made their move, though, she asked if she was sure about all of this for someone like Bella. Gray chimed in, saying she was mistaken. Stopping the experiment was for the goodness of the world. Otherwise, it would go downhill fast. She asked Professor Ariel if she was really sure, seeing as she was doing all this for a person like her. Gray chimed in, saying she was mistaken because halting the experiment was for the greater good of everyone. If they didn't, countless folks would meet their doom. Even worse, the whole world would be thrown under the bus. Bella asked him what he was rambling about. Professor Ariel said Gray might be stretching the truth a bit, but she agreed he needed to be stopped pronto. She reassured Bella not to sweat it too much. She made it clear they weren't putting their lives on hold because of her little drama. Then they packed up and left. Our magic-wielding professor wasted no time summoning a whole bunch of magic circles. She launched an all-out attack on the laboratory, sending the wall crumbling down in a chaotic explosion. Gray couldn't help but think it was a bit extra. With a delightful hole in the wall, they decided to waltz right in. Gray's eyes nearly popped out at the sight before him. It was an eerie, dark alley lined with cells, and there were people who looked like they could use a decent meal chained to the walls. Some were bleeding from lost limbs or nasty puncture wounds. Just one look told Professor Ariel they wouldn't need to search for evidence. There were so many unfortunate souls trapped there. In a split second, she spotted 14 forbidden spells, each a ticket to jail by itself. Not to mention the unauthorized human experiments, just as serious of an offense. As they wandered, something shiny caught their eye. It was some kind of creepy altar. Bella asked what they should do next. They planned to leave with evidence, but it made her wonder if they should rescue the poor souls too. Gray replied they shouldn't linger since Vian might waltz back in any moment. To his surprise, a voice chimed in behind him, asking if he called out. It was Varian. They were all taken aback to see him there. He explained he sent a double to the conference because he had some important experiment to conduct. Professor Ariel inquired about this important experiment. He mentioned he had some fresh materials and wanted to use them before they went bad. He was referring to the bodies hanging in one of the cells, but his plans had shifted. Hearing that made their skin crawl. Apparently, he was looking for materials with a bit more magical zing than your average Joe anyway. He had no clue how they found out about his shady experiments. He was pretty certain they hadn't spilled the beans about their little field trip. So if they vanished, no one would blame him. Professor Ariel caught on that he was planning to turn them into guinea pigs. Varian told her to take a chill pill. Her sacrifice would push the boundaries of magic itself, and since he couldn't let them live, he'd make sure to use them as efficiently as possible. He was caught off guard when a massive fireball zoomed by, nearly hitting him. Boom! It created a huge explosion, and even Professor Ariel wasn't ready for that. Bella was the culprit. They watched the smoke clear, revealing an amused and untouched Vian. He remarked on that divine eye of hers. Ariel still had her game face on, huh? He didn't expect a special admission student like Bella to be such a standout talent. It made him wonder about the other Divine Eye recruits. He claimed he wasn't impressed by Bella's little stunt. An academy student trying to take out a professor pleased Bella shot back that sometimes it's better to kill than to be killed. Too bad she missed her shot. Professor Ariel instructed them to pull back. They'd snagged the evidence so the academy could handle the rest. But of course Vian wasn't about to let them breeze out. He launched a dark orb engulfed in black flames their way. It barely missed Bella. Fortunately, Professor Ariel blocked it, but Bella was still worried for her safety. Varian shrugged it off, saying it was pointless, since it was one of the creatures from his research Gluttony Flame. It spews fire that munches up defensive magic and turns it into fuel, so technically it can't be blocked. The catch: it needed some special materials to conjure. It completely shattered Professor Ariel's magic barrier. She groaned as she activated her eye layering on another barrier. It went up just in time after the first one crumbled, but it was already cracking under the pressure of the Gluttony Flame. She told Bella to take the spell memory pouch to Gray. She assured her that if Heathcote got wind of it, he'd know what to do. Bella tapped her staff on the ground and crafted a wider barrier. Confused, Bella wondered what she was doing and urged her to hurry up and go. But Bella noticed the professor's barrier was on the verge of breaking, so she insisted on taking matters into her own hands. Professor Ariel reminded them of their pact before venturing in. When things go south, life comes first. She sensed Vian's magic was unnatural, meaning their defense spells wouldn't cut it. She promised them she would buy some time, but couldn't finish her thought as her barrier crumbled. She panicked, but Bella comforted her, saying it was all good. Then Bella's magic collided with the Gluttony Flame shielding them as she proclaimed the spell wasn't nearly as powerful as it seemed. It just required a different type of defense magic. Varian's jaw dropped, especially since they were the only ones in the loop about Gluttony Flame's counter magic. He demanded to know how she figured it out. She replied that someone had taught her a new theory, making the spell a piece of cake. He couldn't believe it. Rage boiled inside him. He demanded to know who it was. He assumed it was a traitor. He threatened her if she spilled the beans, he'd treat her to a quick death. She grinned and asked if he really wanted to know the answer. With a sly smile, she said it was a secret. She hinted that he was a student from the swordsmanship class. Gray's mind raced back to their past encounters, especially since they were the ones who knew Gluttony Flame's countermagic. He demanded to know how she figured it out. She stated someone taught her a new theory, making the spell a walk in the park. He was flabbergasted. Anger coursed through him. Who was it? He speculated it was a traitor. He told her that if she revealed who it was, he'd grant her a painless death. She asked if he wanted to know the name of her mentor. She grinned and responded that it was a secret. She dropped a hint that he was a student from the swordsmanship course. Gray recalled their previous interactions. In reality, he just put together a jigsaw puzzle of crazy theories. Varian's veins bulged like a balloon animal when he thought she wasn't taking him seriously. He whipped out a red crystal and proclaimed they would be toast, literally. He crushed the crystal in his hand, and like a ghost on a mission, souls zoomed out and zipped right toward them. It was dark magic at its finest, and it surrounded them like a funky cloud. Gray's mind raced. Was Bella still okay under that spooky gloom? Bella assured him the barrier was still standing strong, but Varian didn't need a crystal ball to know her mana reserves were running low. At best, he gave her about a minute before she'd be out of gas. Bella then asked Professor Ariel to give Varian a little taste of defeat. She had enough on her plate with the whole defense thing. The professor nodded like a true champ. Her eyes lit up, picking out a weak point in the flames. She pushed her mana out of the barrier like it was her last slice of pizza. She started slow testing the waters, then charged up her lightning magic. It shot out like razor blades, dramatic, but eventually fizzled out like a balloon losing air. Varian smirked, noting that their counterattack barely grazed him. Professor Ariel was sweating it. Gray remembered that her offensive magic was about as strong as a wet noodle, and those flames were probably gobbling up her spells like candy. Bella, looking weary, asked what their next move was. Professor Ariel reminded them, "Hey, I told you to skedaddle earlier for a reason." Gray stepped up, puffing out his chest, saying, "Let me handle this." Bella shot him a skeptical look. What was he planning? His sword couldn't even tickle Vian from where they were standing, but Gray was confident it would work out. Professor Ariel raised an eyebrow, asking if he was totally sure about that. If he unleashed that power again, he might not be ready for the lace of death. Even if he survived, his healing arm could be in permanent vacation mode. Hey, he shrugged, better I go down than all three of us. He struck a heroic pose. Varian noticed a red glow cutting through the black flames. Next thing he knew, Gray leapt out like he had springs in his boots. In a flash, there went his head up, and away. Blood painted the scene. Gray was watching, looking all sorts of serious. Bella was left speechless. Varian's headless body hit the ground, and his noggin rolled off like a runaway bowling ball. Professor Ariel was in shock. This was her first live-action horror show. Talk about a jaw-dropper. Bella felt debris raining down like it was the finale of a fireworks show. The ceiling started to have a meltdown. Professor Ariel swung her magic around like a traffic cop, holding the debris in place. She admitted this was way more chaotic than she ever imagined. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyes wide. Gray dropped his sword like it just burned him. His hands were shaking as he admitted, "My main hand's a bit sore and numb, but hey, I can still wave it around." He switched the sword to his other hand, and she realized his training was starting to pay off. "Oh, you're training hard, huh?" he agreed. Back in his village days, if he'd used that move, he'd be waking up in a month, arms permanently rusted. Now, just a sore arm. Progress. While he pondered his newfound strength, Professor Ariel looked at him like he was a superhero. "It's all thanks to you, we're still breathing. I'm really sorry you had to pull that stunt," she said. Gray waved her off. "No sweat, I insisted we had to take down Vian in the first place." Despite his bravado, she thanked him again, but urged him to save the power for later. Otherwise, he might end up as a permanent part of the furniture. He was taken aback. Her worry was a curveball. After a moment of thought, he nodded. "Got it." Just then, Bella piped up. "Wait, was that actually magic? I didn't feel any ether. Trying to box that much power into magic sounds like a wild goose chase." Professor Ariel gently told her to steer clear of that topic and certainly not bring it up again. Bella was curious, asking why, and the professor sighed. "Because I might have to wipe your memory clean, and that's no fun." Bella blinked. "Oh, I get it." She grinned, proposing a magic contract. The professor agreed to that deal. They signed on the dotted line, and after that, Gray was all, "What's our next move?" He was itching to help the people, but first had to check the magical snoozers. They looked like they were napping in a magic dreamland. Professor Ariel said even though they were snoozing soundly, it was best to get them to the Academy's medical wing, just to be safe. With a snap of her fingers, the whole area sparkled in gold, wrapping each of the people in a glow as warm as a cozy blanket. Now that the protective magic was in place, she invited them to delve deeper. Upon a second glance, she was appalled. It was a mad scientist convention with illegal experiments popping up everywhere. Most of them were twisted ideas involving human sacrifices to crank out magic catalysts or amp up human magical abilities. She didn't see anything about the Liquidator, which got her thinking it was probably being kept in a secret lair somewhere. Gray found it odd. This was the site of that previous catastrophe that wiped out tons of folks back when he was just a regular Joe. He puzzled over how a simple catalyst creation could have led to such chaos. Then it hit him. The deadly miasma was what took those people down in his past life, bubbling up from below ground. Professor Ariel noticed his contemplative look and asked what was on his mind. Bella leaned in too. He had a nagging feeling that something sinister was lurking beneath them. There could be hidden horrors. Taking a longer look around, she noticed how bonkers this place really was. They were conducting illegal experiments everywhere she turned. Most of them involved human sacrifices to whip up magic catalysts or boosting a human's magical skills. But she didn't see anything related to the Liquidator, which made her suspect it was hidden in another facility. Gray found it the strangest thing, given that this spot was where the disaster that took out tens of thousands happened before he turned back time. How did producing a magical catalyst snowball into that mess? Then he recalled that in his past life, a toxic miasma had seeped up from the ground and caused all that chaos. Professor Ariel noticed his change in expression and asked what was the matter. Bella checked in on him as well. He was getting a gut feeling that something shady was lurking beneath this place. He suggested there might be something hidden down there. Professor Ariel caught the look on his face and asked him what was up. Bella was also checking in on him. He had this nagging feeling that something was lurking beneath that place. He suggested there could be something hidden down there, passages that dive underground. Professor Ariel scanned the area. There were bloodstains and dirt all over the place, but no secret tunnels, until her special eye caught something sneaky. She shuffled over to investigate. She squatted down to examine the floor. It was pretty weak, but she detected love taps from short-distance teleportation magic in that spot. She figured it was a space you could only crash into using teleportation magic. By the vibes, the teleportation distance was about 300 meters. She had a hunch something was lingering there. Gray asked if they could hop over to it. She mentioned she could whip up a short-distance teleportation gate too, so she gave it a whirl. A magic circle sizzled into existence on the ground. If it was a flop, the other side would just lead to plain old Earth. The gate swung open and their jaws dropped at what greeted them. It was a sprawling area packed with buildings, almost like a city. No one would guess there was a whole world hiding beneath that establishment. Bella sensed a monstrous surge of ether flooding the place, especially from a simple circular building she pointed to. Professor Ariel noticed it wasn't just ether. There was a power seeping through that was as different from magic as night is from day, and it was significantly stronger than anything she had previously encountered. Gray had a gut feeling about what the power was. Professor Ariel confirmed his hunch. It was the Liquidator's power. With that, the three of them entered the building, discovering a vacant hallway with one solitary door. She verified that the power was definitely coming from there, yet there was zero sign of the Liquidator hanging around, so she gave the door a knock. When she finally swung it open, Bella got a tad anxious, worried they might be meddling with something they shouldn't. She told Bella to chill out. This door didn't hold any real power. It was merely a decorative token for rituals. The magic wasn't in the door itself, but in the magical doodads surrounding it. Suddenly, the magical gizmo started to glow, while Professor Ariel stood right in the mix. Gray asked what was going on. He speculated she might be trying to summon the Liquidator, or something equally bizarre. Bella got a whiff of danger from the magic and suggested hitting the brakes immediately, but Professor Ariel told them not to rush. Her intuition told her this setup wasn't designed for summoning the Liquidator anyway. The door creaked open, and a void of darkness began to peek through. Gray started sweating, worrying the space was ripping apart. Bella called out to the professor for reassurance. The magic flickered out slowly. The others were puzzled, but it turned out just as Professor Ariel had anticipated. She confirmed those contraptions weren't meant to call the Liquidator. They just punched a tiny hole toward wherever it was lurking. Then they funneled the leaking power. The core they used to crystallize the power was likely a human life or two. She estimated that 10 souls had been used so far, but the crafting process probably required even more sacrifices. She speculated that most of the folks they spotted upstairs were likely harvested as raw materials. Bella wondered why they would go to such lengths just for a bit of power. She questioned what they were up to with it. That black flame Vian used in their brawl was likely juiced up by the crystal, which was just leftover junk after they finished processing it. She recognized the catalyst wasn't limited to flames either. If they managed to mass produce it, who knew what their ultimate game plan was? The cracks on the door started to vanish. Gray asked whether Varian really wasn't trying to summon the Liquidator after all, but Professor Ariel couldn't tell if he hadn't attempted it or just couldn't. She scrutinized the magical gadgets and assessed they were pushed to their limits. It could mean this whole setup was all they could manage. Bella glanced around and deemed the apparatus was an absolute goldmine. She had never witnessed spatial warp magic so precise and powerful. Professor Ariel agreed, revealing that crafting one of those would take a nation's budget. But 8 of them, one organization popped into her mind. Bella guessed it was the Discar Empire, but that was a no-go. They might be the biggest fish in the sea, but they probably lacked the magical research mojo to whip one of those up. Bella pried about who it could be instead. Professor Ariel mulled over an organization whose magical research made the Empire look like amateurs. Gray figured it might be none other than the World Union Academy. Bella looked a bit lost. Professor Ariel confirmed he was spot on. There was no other research entity that could strut around with that scale and budget. A heavy silence fell among them until Bella broke the tension, questioning if the Academy was genuinely behind all this. She could hardly believe it since the World Union Academy was supposed to save the world from the bad guys. Professor Ariel could see why she was in disbelief, but she couldn't think of any other group capable of such a massive operation. Gray argued that didn't mean the whole academy was out to get them. He believed most of the folks there would stand on their side, because before his regression, the academy's top dogs were always on the front lines. Even beyond the subjugation squads, they were busy protecting civilians right until the bitter end. After witnessing that future, he couldn't swallow the idea that the academy was humanity's villain. Professor Ariel pointed out he had a point. Most of the academy probably acted for the greater good and wouldn't endorse reckless experiments that wasted lives. However, the academy packed plenty of researchers and facilities. Hardly anyone out there truly knew the whole picture. She could sense that whoever was pulling Vian's strings had some serious backing. Still, the academy had a ton of researchers and facilities. Barely anyone in the world really understood the complete story, and she sensed that whoever masterminded Varian was not doing it halfway. He definitely couldn't have pulled off all that just by waving his badge around. Bella figured out that trusting the academy was probably not the best idea either. Professor Ariel had been observing the circus from the inside for decades after all. One thing she could confidently say is that you can't just throw all your faith into this organization. Most folks inside genuinely believe they're the heroes of humanity. Even the lab rats behind the crazy experiments probably trick themselves into thinking they're doing it for some grand cause. Truth be told, it was likely buried so deep that it was practically in Narnia. Gray was all ears, looking for any ideas on how to catch the big cheese. Bella glanced around but came up empty-handed. Not a single communication gadget to be found in this joint. Not even a wee bit of the maker's magic residue was left in the rigs. They were covering their tracks so well it felt like hunting for a needle in a haystack. Just then she felt a rumble. An ear-splitting explosion echoed behind Bella. The roof came crashing down like it was auditioning for a disaster movie. Pure chaos erupted. She took a quick look and noticed that they had even rigged up machines to wipe away the evidence. But they didn't blow the place up right after Vian kicked the bucket, which made her think they were just waiting to sucker punch any snoopers before going full kaboom. Bella shouted that this was not the time for theories. They really needed to hightail it out of there. Professor Ariel told her to chill. It was only a bit of magical fireworks. She said the professors at the World Union Academy were definitely tough enough not to kick the bucket from something like that. Professor Ariel set up a magic circle and warned them to stay put. The magic rigs surrounding them lit up like it was disco night. Boy, they really dodged a bullet this time. Thankfully, they poofed away just before everything turned into Swiss cheese. They popped up outside the lab, along with a few other not-so-lucky folks who managed to escape. Bella thought she was just a hair away from meeting her maker. Gray noted that being that close to the lab wasn't exactly calming. Professor Ariel mentioned they were carrying more baggage than she'd thought, which made the teleportation take a little longer. But hey, it was worth it, since they also snagged the magic rigs. Once they flashed those bad boys to the academy, there was no way they could be ignored. The night dragged on, and by the morning, they found out the survivors were being treated in the academy's medical wing. The messenger of this news was none other than the head honcho of the World Union Academy, Oradram Alexandro. He thanked them for putting an end to Vian's shady experiments. Then he launched into a conversation about the magic rigs. Each one was worth more than an entire country's budget. Professor Ariel was fully aware of that, and there were 8 rigs in total. She was convinced that there's no way he managed to amass that kind of firepower all by himself. The mystery of how he did it nagged at her. He casually threw out that they were hot merchandise swiped right in the middle of being transported, with 78 transport agents wiped clean in the process. Now, that's some shocking news. Hearing about 78 dead transport agents, she was suddenly reminded of an incident from 15 years ago. Alexandro confirmed that the stolen goodies back then were those very magic rigs. Professor Ariel's memory kicked in as she recalled who was responsible. He revealed it was none other than Bloodrinker. He assumed she was familiar with the name. Gray certainly was. He had dealings with the planet's biggest crime syndicate. Bella pitched in, calling them the world's greatest freeloaders, always crawling back like they own the place, no matter how many times they get squashed. Her fiery description made Gray cock an eyebrow at her. But it all clicked when she admitted they were the ones who wiped out her parents. Alexandro nodded in agreement, confirming her description. Despite being hunted down hundreds of times, they always seemed to bounce back. No one had a clue where they hid or who led their ragtag army. Rumor had it that over 10% of all crime-related deaths came courtesy of them. Alexandro wouldn't be surprised if some of their cronies were already sneaking around the academy. To top it off, figuring out who they were was like trying to find a grain of sand on a beach. Even if they had the means, the academy wouldn't lift a finger to stop them. This tidbit made Gray raise an eyebrow, wanting to know what he meant. Professor Ariel responded that this was how the academy rolled nowadays. Anyone with even a smidge of talent gets a ticket to grow stronger, regardless of their background, race, or gender. Alexandro chimed in, confirming that it didn't matter if they were criminals. Bella shouted that that was downright ludicrous. She argued that if there were criminals, they should be dealt with like old laundry. Alexandro agreed, but it turned out the higher-ups didn't share his views. She was baffled since he was supposed to be the head honcho. He replied that he was merely a pawn in the game. He clarified that he was just the face of the academy paperwork, but the real power he wielded was laughable. He asked if they genuinely wanted to know who called the shots. Gray and Bella nodded enthusiastically. Alexandro then revealed they had to beef up their strength because the more power they showed, the deeper they'd be let into the academy's dark secrets. While he couldn't spill any names, he mentioned an upperclassman who had enough influence to steer the entire academy's ship. Even that wild idea of accepting criminals was his brainchild. Gray wanted to confirm what he suspected, and Alexandro told him they could even turn the academy upside down with their strength alone. That lit a fire in them, visible through their clenched fists shaking like leaves in a storm. Alexandro couldn't help but chuckle because he knew Ariel stood no chance against Vian at all. So it stood to reason that one of those two had pulled a rabbit out of their hat. He couldn't deny that Ariel's divine eye was sharper than ever. He was eager to see what kind of beast she would mold into a champion. After that, Gray strolled down the hallway solo, taking a moment to check the mark on his arm. Alexandro found it downright hilarious since he knew Ariel didn't stand a chance against Vian, so it had to be one of those two students causing a ruckus. He couldn't argue that. Ariel's divine eye was as sharp as a tack. He was practically buzzing to discover what kind of monster she was training up in here. After that, Gray wandered the hallway like he lost his way. He took a peek at the mark on his arm like it was the first time he'd ever seen it. As he pondered how power plays the puppet master at the academy, whether they're looking to take down the Liquidator or figure out the shenanigans happening behind the curtain, first things first, they need to beef up. When he glanced up, he spotted someone and promptly excused himself. To his utter shock, the guy retaliated with a swift kick. He managed to block it with his forearms, but still got knocked off his feet. His shoes skidded along the floor until he regained his balance. The kicker smirked, remarking that he was tougher than he looked. Gray shot back with a "What's your problem?" The guy was livid at Gray's audacity since it was he who strutted around like he owned the joint. The dude claimed that a special admit reject like Gray didn't even belong in this hallway. Gray realized he must be one of those anti-special slot haters. This was the first time someone had actually kicked him in the hall. Gray needed to confirm if the dude was trying to start a brawl. The guy seemed eager for a fight, but then reject number 2 strolled into the scene. Gray turned to check out who he was talking about, and just like that, the guy skedaddled. As he strolled away, he was murmuring to someone on the side. He apologized to that person and explained that security was like a hawk, so he couldn't get any closer. Turns out he was chatting with Vian. Just when we thought that old scoundrel was still breathing, Professor Ariel eyed Gray and asked what the commotion was about. Gray recounted that some random student kicked him, declaring that a Divine Eye special admit like him had no business walking the academy hallways. Since no weapons were drawn and no injuries were reported, Professor Ariel was kinda stuck in a bind, so she jokingly suggested he chase the guy down and knock the lights out of him. Gray was taken aback, surprised that she was giving him the green light. Technically speaking, she couldn't formally permit him, but she claimed her eyesight had been getting pretty lousy lately. So if any kind of drama was brewing, Gray found that a bit too sketchy, so he decided to let the guy be. He didn't want to stir up any more trouble. Professor Ariel sighed dramatically, declaring it a pity, but she was genuinely curious if Divine Ice special admits were really hated that much. He told her some folks poked fun, but this was the first time it turned. Apologizing profusely, she expressed regret for not having more clout at the academy. He reassured her with a friendly smile, saying there was no need to stress. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't even be studying at the academy. Plus, he was sure that Bella and the others would prove the Divine Eye program was no fluke. After all, she had a good eye for her. Blushing and speechless, she thanked him, her admiration for him growing. Wow, Bro RZ was really stepping it up. Then she chastised him for acting like it wasn't his problem, stating that out of everyone in the Divine Eye group, he was the one she had the highest expectations for. She believed that Amy Whiteleek Muller, Jacob Bloomfield, even the OG special admits would all become top tier eventually. But the moment she genuinely believed someone could surpass humanity itself was when she met him. He felt uneasy being compared to them, but quickly the mastermind pulling the strings behind Vian likely hadn't given up on summoning the Liquidator just yet, and even the greatest heroes couldn't land a scratch on that monster. He came back to this point in time to ensure he could defeat it. He recalled what he was told the fate of the world was in his hands. After that encounter, swordsmanship class turned into a live combat extravaganza. The students paired off based on the list on the board. Gray had to sharpen up for this practical session, otherwise the whole academy would be throwing shade at the Divine Eye, admits again. At the bare minimum, he had to show he could hang with the regular students. But guess who he got paired with? Leon Hard Apius, the top dog in swordsmanship. Yup, he was the strongest first-year student. The professor announced that they'd be matched with students of similar skill levels, so no holding back time to treat this like a real fight. But Gray thought that was a punchline. He wondered how fate decided he'd end up battling the creme de la creme when he barely scraped in as a special admit. And to make matters worse, the guy seriously despised Divine Eye students. He figured Leon would be itching to wreck his face after last year's fiasco. Just then, someone caught our hero's attention. Leon Hard swaggered over wearing a grin. He cheerfully said he was glad they were partners. Deep down, he figured if he got to spar with Gray, being the top of the class would totally be worth it. In Leon's mind, he had put in more effort than anyone. He wanted to strut his swordsmanship in front of Gray. Gray's lip curled at the sight. Leon Hart's smile was blindingly cheerful, which only made him more convinced that Leon couldn't wait to legally beat him up. He stammered back, claiming he was looking forward to it. Seriously, check that face out. Moments later, the professor asked if everyone was geared up. And just like that, the match was on. With a lightning-fast move, Leon Hart attacked. Gray barely managed to block with his sword. He struggled getting pushed backward when Leon swung. Leon was focused on the fight. He lunged again, and Gray barely dodged the blow. He gripped his sword tightly and counterattacked. Leon Hart parried the strike, acknowledging that Gray actually had some strength. It was tough to believe he wasn't admitted through regular channels. They engaged in a flurry of sword clashes. Gray expected to be demolished in an instant, but shockingly he was hanging in there. Still, he couldn't match Leon's raw power even with all his might. He thought it was all a big joke. How on earth was he supposed to throw down with the top student when he barely slid in as a special admit? And to top it off, that dude already had a vendetta against Divine Eye students. He figured this guy would be chomping at the bit to beat him to a pulp after the disaster from last year. Just then, someone caught our MC's eye. Leon Hard made his way over, grinning like a cat who swallowed a canary, and said he was thrilled to be paired with him. Inside, he was pumped since he got to spar with Gray. He thought being king of the class might actually be within his grasp. In Leon's mind, he trained harder than anyone else out there, wanting to show off his sword skills and dazzle Gray. Gray's face scrunched up when he saw him. Leon Hart's smile was blindingly bright, almost like he was loving that he finally had a legitimate reason to pummel him. He could practically hear the glee in his voice. He stammered out that he was excited for the challenge. Just look at his face seriously. A few moments later, the professor asked if everyone was ready, and bam, the match was on. Leon Hart was like a bull charging at a matador right out of the gate. Gray managed to block his initial swing with his sword, but man did he struggle. Leon swung like he was trying to chop down a tree, pushing Gray back, focused like a laser. Gray then gripped his sword like it was the last cookie in the jar and gave a counterattack. Leon blocked it and nodded, acknowledging that this kid might actually be strong. Hard to believe he didn't make it through the regular admission route right. They kept clashing swords like they were in a crazy duel at a Renaissance fair. Gray thought for sure he'd get destroyed in a flash, but look at him. He was holding his own, albeit barely. His poor arms were screaming at him. Leon Hart's sword skills were absolutely wild. His style was straight out of a manual, and he called it polite swordsmanship. but it was taken to a level that could scare anyone. Even with his experience from a previous life and the training from his master, you couldn't help but think of Leon Hart as a beast for someone just getting started in this life. Their duel had all the other students watching slack-jawed, especially as Gray seemed to hold his own against Leon Hart. Leon Hart was feeling on top of the world. He boasted that he could do this all day, but Gray felt a bit anxious since he knew his stamina was running low. If it weren't for Heathcote's brutal training, he'd be sprawled out on the floor like a rag doll. What Gray didn't realize was that Leon Hart was secretly bummed he wasn't even breaking a sweat. It wasn't obvious that Gray was nearing his limit. Deep down, Gray felt the pressure to wrap this up before he collapsed. He remembered the professor saying to treat this like a real fight, so he focused and eyed Leon Hart closely. When the sword came slicing at him, he ducked, and while on the ground, he twisted his body, using his hands like he was auditioning for a martial arts movie. Leon Hart totally didn't see that coming. When Gray lunged for his ankle, Leon Hart's eyes went wide as he realized Gray was treating this like it was life or death. Leon Hart tightened his grip on his sword. He was giving it his all because losing was simply not in the cards. After a flurry of clashes, the two ended up with their swords practically tickling each other's throats. Gray called it a draw. He helped Leon Hart up, and Leon Hart accepted the help, but chuckled that it wasn't exactly a fair match since, in the end, all he could manage was a desperate swing. Meanwhile, Gray could have easily skewered him right in the heart if he'd wanted to. But hey, it was just a practice duel, so Gray made a show of only thrusting his sword towards Leon Hart's neck. Gray remarked that even with all the fancy protection spells, sticking a sword at someone's heart in a practice duel was pretty shady. Leon Hart conceded he lost, and thanked Gray for showing him the stark difference between a real fight and a casual practice. Gray humbly retorted that it was sort of a cheap trick for the swordsmanship class. Leon Hart shot back that the instructor specifically said to treat it like a real battle, so there's no room for cheating in that world. Then he threw out a wild idea to go for another round. Gray wasn't exactly pumped about that. He only won because he caught Leon Hart off guard. If they squared off fairly, he knew he wouldn't stand a chance. It wasn't just about who had the flashiest moves anymore. He knew Leon Hart's stamina would run circles around him, but then someone cut into the fun. The guy pointed out they were in a sword class, and no one said he could use anything but a sword. He also took a jab at how a special admit like him ended up matched with the top student. He warned him not to let his newfound magical powers go to his head. It wasn't like Gray had orchestrated this pairing. Leon Hart jumped in to defend him, saying the instructor deemed Gray worthy to square off with him. He told the dude to zip it. The instructor backed Leon Hart up, reminding everyone he paired students with similar strength levels, and Gray was genuinely the only one capable of challenging Leon Hart. Leon Hart nodded as if to say, "I'm not wrong." The instructor then challenged the other student to step up against Gray if he was feeling brave. If he could win, he'd get the chance to tussle with Leon Hart. He was game for that. Then he bragged to Gray about how he had once beaten the exam proctor to get into the academy. He definitely didn't want to be grouped with those who just barely passed or the ones who failed entirely. Leon Hart recognized this dude was judging Gray based on his admission status without having a clue about Gray's true strength. He saw a reflection of his younger self in that guy, but he also figured it was a prime opportunity to showcase Gray's true power. More than that, he was just irritated this guy interrupted his time with Gray. The guy picked up on his sour expression. Leon Hart was almost ready to throw down just for that offense. Poor guy was confused, wondering why Leon Hart looked so angry. Since the guy was already against the whole aerial combat rule, he agreed that they'd stick to using just their swords. He checked in with Gray to see if he was cool with that. Gray had no clue how powerful the guy was, but he figured if he got into the academy through regular exams, he wouldn't be a total joke. It was clear he was packing more stamina and muscle than Gray. Even after his master's grueling training, he couldn't match up against years of solid nourishment and conditioning. He admitted he wasn't brimming with confidence in his skills, but losing wouldn't get him kicked out of the academy. The instructor confirmed that was true. It was just a practice class, but he reminded everyone to not go easy on each other. After hearing that, Gray steeled himself. When the signal to start was given, the guy rushed at him like a freight train. He was totally pumped to put Gray in his place. Gray blocked the attack and got slightly thrown off. He pushed the guy back, and felt the hits were lighter than he expected. The guy's power wasn't all that impressive. But of course, this dude came at him again. Gray wondered if he was pulling back. He simply swung his sword. To everyone's shock, he actually landed a hit and the guy started bleeding. He toppled to the ground and the instructor proclaimed that the match was finished. Gray freaked out and asked if he was okay. He aimed for the guy's sword but somehow hit him. He had totally expected him to dodge. But this dude insisted it was just a fluke, claiming he was caught off guard. His face was a mess, streaming tears and smudged blood all over his nose and cheeks. Still, with his ego soaring higher than his brain could handle, he challenged Gray again. The other students couldn't help but snicker, seeing how ridiculous he looked. He was aiming for Leon's sword, but lo and behold, he actually hit the guy. He expected him to nimbly dodge it, but this dude insisted it was just a lucky shot, and he totally wasn't ready for it. His face was a total wreck, tears and blood, like he just lost a wrestling match with a bear. But with more ego than sense, he challenged our MC again. Everyone erupted in. It was a complete disaster with tears streaming and blood smudged on his nose and cheeks. But because his ego was larger than his brain, he threw down the gauntlet to our main character once again. The other students couldn't help but laugh at him since it was a real doozy. The instructor just let out a big old sigh. Then he reluctantly agreed to let them continue until they got their fill. He charged at them again. Time ticked by. Gray was looking okay. He asked the dude if he was still in one piece. The poor guy could barely crack his eyelids. His face looked like a modern art masterpiece full of bruises and bumps. When he slurred out that he was fine, he still stood there like a warrior ready for battle. Given the sorry state he was in, the instructor had to step in and call it quits. He instructed one of the students to escort him to the infirmary. Afterward, he proudly announced that the year's representatives were Gray and Leon Hart. He asked the class if anyone had any objections. Gray was scratching his head, unsure what representatives even meant. The instructor explained that the top first years would face off against the second-year champ in a battle for bragging rights. The first years had faced defeat 35 times in a row, but with Gray in the mix, he felt this year might finally be the game changer. Gray, however, was stunned to learn about those 35 losses. He questioned whether the power gap between first years and second years was really that staggering. The instructor confirmed absolutely a year at the academy is like a lifetime, my friend. He calmly reassured them that losing was par for the course. In fact, it was expected, so putting up even a decent fight was something to write home about, and if by some miracle they won, it would be legendary among school tales. Just getting picked to fight was a badge of honor. The professor gave Gray a hearty pat on the back and told him not to fret about it too much. Then he dismissed the class like a bell ringer on his way out. Gray came to the realization that the inter-year battle wasn't as grim as he thought. Still, as a special student with the Divine Eye, it was the golden opportunity he needed to show off his skills. He knew he had to crank up the training. Meanwhile, the faculty was holding a meeting, and last on their list was Professor Budra's eyebrow-raising proposal. Professor Ariel was watching him like a hawk. Professor Budra from the magic department suggested they kick Amy White to the curb. Professor Ariel chimed in, curious about why he'd even suggest that, especially since she was the one running the Divine Eye program. Professor Budra pointed out that was exactly the issue. Amy White had bombed the third year's advancement exam, yet here she was, still hanging around like a bad smell. He noted that all other students who flunked got kicked out. It just didn't seem fair to him. The headmaster, Alexandro, sat there like a statue. Professor Ariel fired back that Amy was steadily advancing toward top-tier, world-class combat readiness. Since her body had been through a rough patch, she couldn't show her full potential. If it weren't for that, she would have aced it hands down. The other professors shared their less-than-impressed views on that excuse again. One of them, beside Professor Budra, rolled his eyes and said that blaming her tough body backlash made a mediocre student sound like some sort of mystery prodigy. He shot back, asking how long she'd keep selling this fantasy of hidden powers. Professor Ariel stood her ground, insisting it was true. She believed Amy could gain control at any moment, perhaps even tomorrow. If they rushed her, she could lose that chance forever. They persisted that Amy had used the same excuse before. The professor saw it as her allowing someone who couldn't meet the academy's standards to loiter indefinitely. She countered that the academy's purpose was to nurture exceptional talent. Tossing out someone with potential just because they didn't fit the mold was counterproductive. Professor Boudra was skeptical about that talent. He said that special admissions used to mean something, but this current crop was a hot mess of failures. His list of examples included Amy White Bella Albbright and Jacob Bloomfield. To him, the once great Divine Eye was dulling down to a duller shade of gray. The professor next to him suggested scrapping the Divine Eye program altogether, and Professor Ariel was taken aback. She asked them what planet they were living on. Professor Boudra pointed out that it was forged ages ago by the Academy's founders, so it could be just as easily scrapped if the majority of the faculty was on board. Some professors grumbled that the current crop of Divine Eye students didn't exactly dazzle. Sure, they had seen Bella Albbright improve, but it wasn't like she was breaking records. Also, what's up with her sketchy mana capacity? Professor Ariel felt trapped. An older fellow joined in, stating that while past Divine Eye students were impressive, this new bunch didn't hold a candle to them. The others agreed, saying they lacked the punch of the old days. She scanned the room and noticed some professors smirking like they'd just scored the best snack. While others looked influenced, the anti-Divine Eye voices were louder than she'd anticipated. At this rate, they could really pull the plug on the whole operation. Professor Boudra pressed the point that the program had been outdated for ages, and it was time to move on. He dared Professor Ariel to prove she could spot talent better than everyone else. When she fell silent, he took it as a sign that the cat had indeed got her tongue, and quipped that at least she was aware she was past her prime. The professor next to him suggested to Professor Ariel that she ought to retire before she tarnished her legacy. The others chimed in, saying that if she wanted to nurture her favorite students however she liked, she should just start her own school. Another professor chimed in that she'd need a miracle to find students who'd even think about following a washed-up Divine Eye. Then they all erupted in laughter. Professor Ariel remained quiet. She had faith that she could identify true talent. But those kids needed more time to mature. If only they could hang on long enough to prove themselves. She racked her brain for something to say to salvage the situation. She was supposed to judge talent better than the rest of the crew. She was as quiet as a mouse, so he took it as a sign that the cat had her tongue and said at least she was aware she wasn't in her prime. The professor next to him suggested that maybe Professor Ariel should consider retirement before she tarnished her legacy. Others chimed in, saying if she fancied raising her favorite students however she liked, she might as well open her own school. Another professor quipped that it would take a miracle to find students who'd stick around with the washed-up Divine Eye. Then they all burst into laughter. Professor Ariel silent but confident she could still spot real talent. But those kids needed some time. If they could just hang in there, they'd shine like diamonds. She just had to make sure they didn't get booted before it happened. She racked her brain for something clever to say. When someone brought up one of the Divine students named Gray, the professor who mentioned him remarked that he was a real gem among the first-year swordsmanship students. The long-haired professor shared that Gray was chosen for the inter-year battle. Professor Boudra chimed in, agreeing that it sounded promising, and suggested letting him strut his stuff in the competition. Then they could decide the future of the Divine Eye program. After perusing the results, Professor Ariel glanced over at Professor Heathcote. He caught her eye and shook his head like a disappointed parent. That was her cue to step in. She informed him that Gray's abilities weren't perfect for mock battles, but if it were a life-or-death scenario, she was cut short by Professor Boudra, who looked fed up with her excuses. The professor beside him pointed out that if Gray couldn't shine in training, he certainly wouldn't perform in actual combat. But Professor Ariel firmly argued that Gray had something special that transcended regular swordsmanship. The crowd fell silent. Alexandro wrapped up the meeting since they were going in circles, but he mentioned that seeing the Divine Eye students in action was a worthwhile idea. He planned to catch Gray's performance in the inter-year battle and make a judgment call afterward. That wasn't great news for Professor Ariel. With that, the meeting came to a close. Professor Boudra was itching for the competition. He figured it would be quite the spectacle. Before Professor Heathcote bolted, he shot a look at Professor Ariel, who was still slumped in her seat, looking like she'd lost a game of chess. She felt bad for her students, worried that she was dragging them down with her own weaknesses. She reminisced about Gray in action, fully aware that his power was more combat-ready than mock-ready. And deep down, she knew she was asking for a tall order. She was hopeful he could help those kids, those raw gems with world-class potential, to secure their futures. Tears crept down her cheeks. The day of the inter-year battle finally rolled around. The host announced the start of it, setting the stage with the competitors kicking off with the first-year hotshot Leon Hard A's. Then came the second-year champion Luel Hartman, followed by the first-year challenger Gray Lee. After him, they introduced the second-year challenger, Debil Rardle. Gray yanked his memories and realized it was that same guy who jumped him in the hallway. Talk about a plot twist. He couldn't believe he was going to go head-to-head with him. Everyone would get the chance to see what they were made of. The professors were all eyes and ears. Professor Boudreaux was sporting a smirk that looked like a kid in a candy store. Leon Hart noticed the crowd of professors there to scout the showdown and asked Luel if these inter-year battles were always this hyped. Luel revealed that it was a first only 3 fencing professors bothered to show up last year. It had him wondering why there was such a crowd today. And that's when Leon Hart had his lightbulb moment. Like a miracle. Only 3 fencing professors bothered to show their faces last year. It made him scratch his head, wondering why there were so many that day. Then Leon Hart had a lightbulb moment. Apparently, the professors were just really intrigued by Gray. He gave a mental thumbs up for their great taste. Luinal pondered if that was the real deal with Leon Hart. Professor Boudreaux chimed in that Luinal was spot on. He declared that they had come to check out the ultimate showdown of the Divine Special Admits. That news sent the students into a frenzy. Gray raised an eyebrow and asked for clarification. Professor Boudreaux was flabbergasted that no one had clued him in. Everyone turned to Professor Ariel. Then he dropped the bombshell that the Divine Eye class was getting the axe. That bombshell knocked him off his feet. He looked at Professor Ariel and asked if that was for real. She couldn't meet his gaze. If she spilled the beans, he would push himself into overdrive, and who knew what kind of crazy stunts he might pull. In his current state, it could spell disaster. So she took a deep breath and steadied herself. Finally, she said that Boudreaux was just messing with his head. She encouraged him not to let it rattle him and to just go for it. They fell silent. Gray noticed her hands were shaking like a leaf. He held his tongue and accepted her answer with a nod. Professor Boudreaux urged them to go out there and embarrass themselves. He was sure that after a spectacular fail, the other professors would finally wake up and smell the coffee. Gray decided that wasn't going to fly with him. Professor Boudreaux wasn't ready for that kind of smackdown. Gray told him he didn't care if he got roasted, but he wouldn't stand for anyone bad-mouthing Professor Ariel's judgment. Professor Ariel was taken aback by his words. Professor Boudreaux's feathers got ruffled, and he shot back with a snarky remark about what kind of talent Professor Ariel picked up on Gray. He added that unlike his professor, those with their faculties intact had no doubt he'd tank big time. Gray was fired up to prove them all wrong. That just fanned Professor Boudreaux's flames of fury, and he needed his colleague to cool him off. The host instructed the participants to split into their teams and make their move. Professor Ariel felt grateful for Gray's trust, but she couldn't shake off her concern and curiosity about his plan. If he was going up against the top student, his sword skills might give him a slim shot, but he was stuck with a real doozy of an opponent, Debil Rardle. Bradley had revamped his brain, so his reflexes were downright nightmarish. This guy was practically a weapon, and he was the absolute worst matchup for Gray's sneaky tactics. That had her on edge, especially since Gray might have intended to use that strategy. She called out to him, telling him not to worry about her and to not overexert himself. Gray was taken aback, but then he just flashed a smile and replied that he was in the know. The showdown with the top student was about to kick off, so the representatives were told to step up. The arena was shielded with protective magic to prevent any serious injuries, triggering their opponent's safeguard counts as a win. He was practically a walking weapon. He was the absolute worst matchup for Gray's ambush tactics. This got her all worried, since Gray might have plotted to use that ability against him. She called out to him, saying not to stress about her and that he shouldn't overdo it. Gray was taken aback for a moment. Then he just smiled and casually replied that he was aware. The top student showdown was about to kick off, so the representatives were told to step forward. The arena was decked out with protective magic to dodge any deadly injuries, counting any opponent's safeguards as a win. They were told to throw down like it was the real deal. Once the briefing was done, the epic showdown for the top student kicked off. Leonhardt was the first to make a move, charging in like a bull. Luinal braced himself for the incoming onslaught. Their swords clanged together like a bunch of pots and pans in a rock band. Then Luel went full throttle, launching a more intense assault, but Leonhardt ducked just in time to dodge his sword. He planted his foot firmly for leverage and delivered a jaw-rattling kick to Luol, although that move left him gasping for breath. At that moment, he realized fighting like Gray was not an option. Lionel had managed to dodge that kick like a pro. He had to admit, Leonhardt was impressive, already stronger than he was during his rookie year. With a little pep in his step, he challenged Leonhardt to keep up. When he struck again, Leonhardt managed to deflect the blow, but lost his footing in the process. He was up against the ropes, quite literally pressed against the barrier, and feeling the heat. He spotted the sword zooming towards him, but he was frozen like a deer in headlights. The blade slammed into the wall just inches from his neck, and the host declared that was enough. And suddenly, the winner of the top student match was Luol. Leonhardt graciously thanked him for the bout. Luino chimed in, calling it a good fight. Now it was time for the challenger match. The representatives stepped up to the plate. Leonhardt shot Gray a good luck glance. With Gray's big talk, he had to deliver the goods. He had faced more grim foes than he could remember before rewinding the clock back. So in comparison, he figured he stood a decent chance in this bout. Devil dragged his sword with an ear-piercing screech, telling Professor Bradley to hang tight because he was about to send Gray to a realm best described as not pleasant. The inter-year battle match kicked off. Gray was on the offensive first, but Radel blocked it smoothly. He was caught off guard and got pushed back a bit. Rardel's sword weighed a ton, making his hands quiver. Professor Ariel commented to Gray that Radar's reflexes were juiced up, but it made him ponder if his arm strength was also on steroids. With that kind of power gap, no trick he had up his sleeve would do the trick. He had one last ace, but he was advised to keep that card close, as using it could potentially be a one-way ticket. Back then, he had agreed with Professor Ariel, who'd emphasized that the tourney was key, but his life was worth a lot more. Besides, the arena's protective barrier wasn't robust enough to handle that level of power. If he whipped it out, he might just obliterate his opponent. Fast forward to now, Radar was barreling towards him, as Gray contemplated putting his life on the line for the Divine Eye slot. But there was no way he could play Executioner in a school match. Radar spat out something under his breath before swinging his sword, which Gray somehow managed to deflect. He came back for another round. Gray noted that Radar's moves were unusually straightforward. With those physical stats and lightning reflexes, it was clear Radarly could take him down without breaking a sweat, and he wasn't half bad with technique either, leading Gray to suspect that Radar was holding back. He couldn't shake the feeling that Radar had an agenda, especially with that bone-chilling grin that made Gray feel like he was walking on eggshells. He caught sight of Radar laying eyes on his own eye, realizing dodging it was off the table, but instincts kicked in, and to his astonishment he managed to block the sword. It puzzled him, considering he thought he wouldn't make it in time. Was it possible that Radar intentionally weakened his attack? Professor Ariel leaped from her seat. Through her divine eye, she caught on to something unsettling. A chaotic energy was swirling deep within Radar's chest. She was momentarily distracted when Professor Boudra chimed in, saying it was a total snooze fest of a match. One professor remarked that the second years this time around seemed to have some serious attitude problems. Even though Radar could end it at any moment, he was dragging it out like a kid savoring cake. They could see that the Divine Eye student was barely holding on just to block Radar's relentless strikes, yet he refused to throw in the towel. To them, it merely showed that Gray wasn't packing enough heat. Professor Boudra proposed a theory that Gray might have suspected the Divine Eye's imminent demise, and was hinting to them, since at this rate, the whole Divine Eye gig was bound to turn into a colossal disaster if they kept waiting. The other professors erupted in laughter, agreeing with Boudra, thinking he was quite the considerate student, looking out for the Academy's best interests. Professor Ariel suddenly screamed for them to halt the fight, claiming it was getting too dangerous. Professor Boudra replied with sarcasm, asking her how exactly it was dangerous when it was just a friendly spar. One professor chimed in, explaining that the arena was outfitted with a powerful protective spell, and any potentially fatal attacks were automatically blocked, and he knew she was aware of that. He pointed it out just to make her look foolish. He added that the students could go all out without a care, unless she had some hidden motive for wanting to call off the battle. Gray was really feeling the heat in the arena. Professor Ariel raised her voice, asserting that she understood the protective spell, but was concerned it wouldn't offer adequate protection against the power she had sensed. But it was too late. While they debated, an ominous surge of energy erupted from the arena. It sent shivers down her spine. Radarle wore a sinister expression. His sword was enveloped in a dark aura, and when he unleashed his attack, it was sheer and terrifying. Gray was visibly shaken and overwhelmed. The attack was so intense it sliced through the ground, barely missing Gray's foot, leaving him frozen with fear at the thought that he could have been sliced like deli meat. It had her heart racing. Rod Artle had this shifty grin plastered on his face. His sword was cloaked in a dark aura, and the move he unleashed was staggeringly powerful. Gray was clearly shaken and feeling the pressure. The force was so intense that it tore right through the arena, leaving the ground sliced just a hair's breadth from Gray's foot. The thought of being chopped in half like that was downright terrifying, and he couldn't believe his eyes when it busted through the protective spell like it was made of tissue paper. Professor Boudra let out a yelp that could wake the dead as he narrowly avoided being turned into a pancake, thanks to the barrier. The other professors looked like they'd seen a ghost. Professor Ariel didn't hold back, reminding them that she totally had warned them about this mess. She was busy cursing Vian for sneaking that nasty surprise into a student. Then she flexed her magical muscles and tried to patch up the barrier. It hit her like a ton of bricks that the spectator barrier was tougher than a $2 steak, and she simply couldn't use binding magic. She shouted at the other professors that this was a code red emergency and they needed to shut down the barrier, like yesterday, immediately, and throw the tournament in the trash. She was convinced this wasn't swordsmanship. It was more like a horror show. Professor Boudra and the others were still reeling from what just happened. She screamed at Gray to skedaddle, because trying to stop the fight from the sidelines would take like forever. But Gray knew running wasn't an option. If he turned his back, he'd be toast with Ray Darl still striking away like a madman. The crowd was in full-on panic mode. They were yelling like they were at a rock concert when the attacks went off. Heathcote realized the professor's spells were going to take about 30 seconds to reach the arena, and that was an eternity. They had no choice in the matter. Even though it felt a bit premature to pull it out, he believed Gray could handle it. He urged Gray to envision himself as the sword. He advised him not to swing that sword around. Instead, he needed to channel that power through his body. Gray was too busy dodging attacks to appreciate the sudden pressure. In his head, he thought Heathcote shouldn't just drop this bomb on him out of nowhere. But if the professor believed he could do it, then Gray was going to make it happen. No choice. He locked in on the idea that he was a sleek blade. He stood there ready for action, even with danger looming. The attack got uncomfortably close. All of a sudden, there was an explosion, and Gray popped up right behind Radarl, who looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Gray started to wonder if his enemy had always been this slow, but quickly realized it was him getting faster due to the onslaught. A dark light blazed in the center. Thanks for spending your time with us. Don't forget to catch the next Giga Chad video, and I'll catch you all later. You can show some love for the channel by hopping on the Summon Club membership train. Or, just give that like button some love and keep being awesome. Make sure to catch the next Giga Chad video, and I'll see you all next time. Also, don't forget to support the channel by joining the Summon Club membership. You can also just hit that like button and keep being awesome.